Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The exhaustion hit different that night. You know how it gets when you've been running on fumes for 16 hours straight at the hospital. 29 and already feeling like 50, working as an emergency room nurse in Cleveland had become my whole life, especially after my divorce finalized earlier that year. The highway stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon, completely empty except for the occasional semi-truck thundering past in the opposite direction. Must have been around 2 in the morning on a Wednesday in late October, when everything went sideways. The radio kept cutting in and out with static, which should have been my first warning that something wasn't right. But honestly, I just figured it was the old antenna on my beat-up Ford Explorer acting up again. All I wanted was to get home, take the hottest shower possible, and collapse into bed before my next shift started in 10 hours. The figure appeared in my headlights about 3 miles from my exit, standing right on the edge of the shoulder, where the asphalt meets the gravel. My first thought was that someone had broken down, which happens all the time on that stretch of Interstate 71 between downtown and the suburbs. The person was waving both arms above their head in that desperate way people do when they really need help, wearing what looked like a dark jacket with the hood pulled up. My nursing instincts kicked in immediately, that automatic response to help someone in distress that gets drilled into you during training. But as I started easing off the gas pedal and drifting toward the shoulder, something made me glance at my rearview mirror. And that's when I noticed how dark the road behind me had become. Like all the streetlights had suddenly gone out even though they'd been working fine just seconds before. That's when I saw them. 2 shapes emerging from behind the concrete guardrail on the passenger side, moving in this weird synchronized way that made every alarm bell in my head start screaming. They weren't running or walking normally, more like gliding forward while staying perfectly parallel to each other, maybe 15 feet apart. The person who'd been waving suddenly dropped their arms and stood completely still, not even turning their head to track my car as I was slowing down. My foot hesitated between the brake and the gas for what felt like forever, but was probably only a second or two. The 2 figures from the guardrail were wearing identical clothing, dark pants, and what looked like gray hoodies, and they moved toward my car with this terrifying sense of purpose, like they'd done this exact thing 100 times before. My nursing training includes dealing with aggressive patients and dangerous situations, but this was something else entirely, something calculated and wrong in ways I still can't fully articulate. I slammed the accelerator so hard my tires screamed against the pavement, fishtailing slightly as I jerked the wheel back toward the travel lane. In my side mirror, I caught a glimpse of all 3 figures standing in a perfect line across the shoulder, just watching my taillights disappear into the distance. My phone was in the cup holder, and I grabbed it while trying to keep the Explorer steady at 90 miles per hour, fumbling with the emergency call button. The dispatcher who answered sounded skeptical at first, probably used to false alarms and paranoid drivers, but something in my voice must have convinced her because she said units were already in the area and would check it out immediately. I kept driving way too fast all the way home, checking my mirrors every few seconds and taking a different exit than usual, just in case anyone was following me. The adrenaline didn't start wearing off until I pulled into my apartment complex and sat there in the parking lot with the engine running, scanning every shadow between the buildings. My neighbor, this retired cop named Frank, who always sits on his balcony smoking cigarettes even in the middle of the night, waved at me and called down, asking if everything was okay. I must have looked pretty shaken, because he actually came downstairs in his bathrobe and slippers to check on me. When I told him what happened, his whole demeanor changed, and he said there'd been similar reports along that stretch of highway for the past few weeks. Always late at night, always with the same pattern of someone flagging down cars while others waited nearby. The call from the police came about an hour later, after I'd finally made it inside and was sitting on my couch still wearing my scrubs, clutching a cup of coffee with both hands. The officer on the phone introduced himself as Sergeant Brennan and said they'd found something disturbing at the location I'd described. There were fresh tire marks that matched my vehicle's tread pattern where I'd accelerated away, which proved I'd actually stopped there. But here's what made my whole body go numb with fear. They also found a burned-out sedan about 50 yards further down the shoulder, hidden behind a cluster of trees. The car had been reported stolen from a mall parking lot 3 days earlier, and inside they found personal items suggesting someone had been living in it, including maps of the highway system, with certain spots circled in red marker, my exit being one of them. Sergeant Brennan asked me to come to the station the next morning to look at some security footage they'd pulled from a traffic camera about a mile before where I'd stopped. When I got there, still exhausted but too wired to sleep anyway, they showed me grainy black and white video from earlier that same night. Around midnight, 2 hours before my encounter, the camera captured what looked like 3 people dragging something heavy from a van into the woods near that exact spot. The van didn't have plates, and the image quality was too poor to make out faces, but you could see them making multiple trips back and forth. Then, about 30 minutes before I drove through, the camera caught them positioning themselves along the shoulder, with one person standing in the spot where I'd seen the waving figure, while the other 2 crouched behind the guardrail exactly where I'd seen them emerge. What really disturbed me, though, was what Sergeant Brennan told me next, while we sat in that sterile interview room with fluorescent lights humming overhead. They'd been tracking a group they suspected of running a sophisticated carjacking ring that targeted solo drivers on isolated stretches of highway. The burned car wasn't their vehicle. It belonged to a woman named Jennifer Huang who'd been reported missing 5 days earlier after leaving her night shift at a warehouse 40 miles north. Her credit cards had been used at various gas stations heading south, always late at night, always just one transaction before moving on. The police theorized that the group would use stolen vehicles until they burned them out, literally, to destroy evidence, then move on to acquiring a new one from whoever stopped to help their supposedly stranded member. The detective working the case, a woman named Carla Donovan with tired eyes and coffee stains on her sleeve, showed me Jennifer's photo from her missing person report. She looked about my age, wearing scrubs in the picture because she'd been a nurse too, working nights at a regional medical center. That detail hit me harder than anything else, knowing that we'd probably driven that same stretch of highway hundreds of times, both exhausted after long shifts, both alone in the dark. Detective Donovan said they suspected I wasn't the first person to escape this trap. There'd been 2 other reports in the past month of drivers who'd had similar encounters, but managed to speed away. The difference was that neither of them had called it in immediately like I did, and by the time they reported it days later, there was no evidence left to investigate. They kept me at the station for 3 more hours, going through every detail multiple times, having me mark on a map exactly where I'd seen each figure and which direction they'd moved. The forensics team had found footprints in the gravel that suggested at least 4 people had been present, not just the 3 I'd seen, which meant someone else had been watching from somewhere I hadn't even noticed. Detective Donovan mentioned that they'd also discovered a pattern in the timing. All the encounters happened on weeknights between midnight and 4 in the morning, when traffic was lightest and emergency response times were longest. She gave me her direct number and told me to call immediately if I remembered anything else, or if I noticed anyone following me, because sometimes these groups would fixate on the ones who got away. For the next 2 weeks, I completely changed my routine, taking different routes home, varying my schedule whenever possible, and always leaving the hospital with at least one other person walking to the parking garage. Frank, my neighbor, started checking on me every night when I got home, and I'd text Detective Donovan each time I arrived safely, which probably seemed excessive but gave me some peace of mind. Then, on a Monday afternoon, I got the call that they'd made arrests after pulling over a van on that same stretch of highway for a broken taillight. Inside were 4 people, including a woman who matched the description of the figure who'd been waving that night, along with rope, zip ties, and 3 different stolen license plates. They found Jennifer Huang's hospital ID badge hidden under the spare tire, along with personal items from at least 6 other missing persons cases spanning 3 states. The trial won't start for another few months, but Detective Donovan says my testimony will be crucial since I'm the only witness who called immediately and provided real-time evidence of their method. Jennifer Huang is still missing, along with 2 other victims they've connected to this group. And honestly, that's what haunts me most about this whole experience. I still work nights at the hospital because bills don't stop just because you're scared. But I take the city streets now instead of the highway, adding an extra 20 minutes to my commute. Sometimes when I'm driving home and see someone on the side of the road, even in broad daylight, my chest gets tight and I have to remind myself to breathe. The thing that really stays with me, though, is knowing that if I'd stopped just a few seconds longer, if I'd actually gotten out to help like my instincts first told me to, I would have been another missing person case, another burned out car on the shoulder, another nurse who never made it home from her shift. At 31, I'd been driving cross-country routes for my job as a medical equipment sales rep for almost 6 years, and I'd never had anything worse happen than a flat tire in broad daylight. That night in early September 2022 changed everything about how I travel now. I'd just finished a late presentation at a hospital in Des Moines and was heading to my next appointment in Kansas City, figuring I'd drive through the night and grab a motel room when I got there around 4 in the morning. My silver Toyota Camry had been acting up lately, making this weird grinding noise whenever I turned left too sharply, but my mechanic buddy told me it was probably just the power steering fluid getting low. Nothing urgent. I'd been meaning to get it checked properly, but between back-to-back sales trips and my recent divorce proceedings with Brian, I kept pushing it off. The highway stretched out empty ahead of me, one of those long rural stretches where the nearest town is 40 miles in either direction, just cornfields and darkness on both sides. The temperature gauge started creeping up around midnight, right when I was passing through the absolute middle of nowhere on Highway 169. First, it just nudged past the center mark, which happens sometimes on long drives, but within 5 minutes it was climbing toward the red zone, and I could smell that distinct burnt sweet odor of overheating coolant. I pulled over onto the shoulder, my hazard lights clicking in rhythm with my quickening heartbeat, and killed the engine before any serious damage could happen. Steam started hissing out from under the hood almost immediately, creating these ghostly white wisps in my headlight beams that dissipated into the darkness. The silence hit me like a physical weight once the engine stopped ticking and pinging as it cooled down. No cricket sounds, no wind through the corn, just absolute stillness broken only by the metallic cooling sounds of my engine. I checked my phone and of course 0 bars, not even emergency service, which seemed impossible. But there it was, that dreaded no service message mocking me from the screen. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, door locked, windows cracked just enough to keep the interior from fogging up, scrolling through useless offline apps on my phone just to have something to do with my nervous energy. Every few minutes I'd pop the hood release and walk around to check if the steam had stopped, but the engine was still way too hot to even think about removing the radiator cap. The owner's manual in my glove compartment said to wait at least 30 minutes before attempting anything, and even then, only if you had coolant or water to add. Which of course I didn't, because why would I ever think to keep emergency supplies in my car like a responsible adult? That stretch of 169 was notorious for being empty at night, mostly used by truckers during daylight hours, and locals who knew better than to drive it after dark. I'd passed maybe 3 vehicles in the last hour before breaking down, and that was during the relatively busy midnight hour. Now, approaching 1 in the morning, the chances of seeing another car were getting slimmer by the minute. The first hint of hope came as a faint glow on the horizon behind me, barely visible in my side mirror, just a slight brightening of the darkness that meant headlights were coming from several miles away. I actually said thank God out loud to myself and started rehearsing what I'd say to whoever stopped, already planning to offer them $50, just to follow me to the nearest gas station once my car cooled down enough to limp there. The lights grew steadily brighter, taking forever to close the distance, which made sense given how flat and straight the highway was in that area. As they got closer, I could make out that it was something big, definitely not a regular car, maybe a pickup truck or an SUV based on how high and widely spaced the headlights were. I turned on my phone's flashlight and got out of the car, standing by my open driver's door and getting ready to wave them down, figuring nobody could miss a woman standing next to a car with hazards going on an otherwise empty highway. The vehicle started slowing down about a quarter mile away, which gave me this huge wave of relief, because for a second there, I thought they might just blow past me like I wasn't even there. But then it kept slowing down, way more than necessary, crawling forward at maybe 5 miles per hour for the last 100 yards or so. The headlights were blinding me directly now, making it impossible to see anything about the vehicle itself except that it was definitely a van, one of those tall commercial types, maybe white or light gray from what I could glimpse around the light glare. It finally came to a complete stop directly across from me in the opposite lane, engine running rough and loud, like it needed a new muffler, or maybe had some kind of modification to make it sound more aggressive. The headlights stayed on full brightness, pointed right at me and my car, and I had to shield my eyes with my hand while waiting for someone to roll down a window or open a door. But nothing happened. The van just sat there maybe 15 feet away, engine rumbling in this deep, irregular rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the empty highway and into my chest. 30 seconds passed, then a minute, and still no movement from the van, no dimming of the lights, no window rolling down, nothing. I couldn't see through the windshield at all because of how the headlights were angled and how they were reflecting off my car's windows and chrome, creating this wall of harsh white light between us. I waved my phone flashlight in a friendly greeting motion and called out, "Hey, thanks for stopping," but my voice sounded thin and weak against the rumbling engine noise. When there was still no response, I took a few steps forward, thinking maybe they couldn't hear me, but then stopped myself because something about the whole situation was starting to feel wrong in a way I couldn't quite define. The logical part of my brain was saying they were probably just being cautious, maybe an older person who was scared to get out and help a stranger at night, or possibly someone on the phone trying to call for help on my behalf. But the primitive part of my brain, that ancient survival instinct we all have, was screaming at me to get back in my car right now. I slowly backed toward my Camry, keeping my eyes on the van even though I couldn't see anything useful through the light glare, and slid back into the driver's seat without turning my back on the other vehicle. My fingers found the door lock button and I pressed it, hearing all 4 locks engage with a solid thunk that made me feel marginally safer, even though I knew how useless those locks would be if someone really wanted to get in. The van's engine note changed slightly, revving up a bit like someone was pressing the gas pedal while in park, and then I saw something that made my whole body go rigid with fear. The driver's door was opening, just a crack at first, maybe 2 or 3 inches, but enough for me to see that the interior dome light had been removed or disabled because no light came on inside. The door stayed open like that for at least 10 seconds, just barely ajar, and I could swear I saw movement in that dark gap, like someone was watching me through the opening. Then, just as suddenly as it had opened, the door pulled shut with a solid thump that I could hear even over the engine noise. My car key was already in my hand, and I shoved it into the ignition, turning it even though I knew the engine was still too hot and probably wouldn't start without causing serious damage. The starter motor whined in protest and the engine tried to turn over but couldn't quite catch, just making these horrible grinding sounds that I knew meant expensive repairs, even if I got out of this situation. The temperature gauge was still showing way too high, but I didn't care anymore because that van door opening had changed everything about what this was. I tried starting it again, pumping the gas pedal like that would somehow help, and this time the engine caught for maybe 2 seconds before dying with a shudder that shook the whole car. Through all of this, the van hadn't moved an inch, just sat there with its headlights burning into my retinas. But now I noticed something else that made my situation even worse. There was another set of headlights in my rearview mirror, coming up from behind me, moving slowly just like the van had done. This second vehicle, another large one from what I could tell, crept up and stopped about the same distance behind me as the van was in front, boxing me in completely on this narrow shoulder. Its headlights were on high beam too, filling my car with light from both directions, making me feel like I was on a stage under spotlights. I grabbed my phone again, desperately trying to get any signal, even just one bar to make an emergency call, but still nothing. I was holding it up toward the window, moving it around, trying to catch any possible signal, when I heard car doors opening, not slamming shut but opening from both vehicles at the same time. Through the blinding light I could barely make out shapes, 2 figures from the van in front and at least one from whatever was behind me, all moving slowly and deliberately, not rushing but not hesitating either. They were staying just outside the direct beams of their own headlights, keeping to the shadows at the edges, where I could only see silhouettes and suggestions of movement. One of them walked up to my passenger side window and just stood there, close enough that I could see they were wearing dark clothes, maybe jeans and a jacket, but their face was completely hidden in shadow above my window line. They didn't knock, didn't try the handle, just stood perfectly still like they were waiting for something. Another figure appeared at my driver's side, same distance away, same completely motionless stance, and I realized they were positioned so I couldn't open either door without hitting them. The third one, and now I could see there was definitely a fourth one too, circled around to the front and back of my car. I was completely surrounded, and they were all just standing there in absolute silence, not making any demands, not trying to communicate, just waiting. The only sound was the 2 engines idling, and my own ragged breathing that was fogging up the windows despite my efforts to control it. I had my phone ready to use as a weapon if needed, which sounds ridiculous now, but at the time it was literally the only thing I had besides my car keys. Then one of them, the one by my passenger window, lifted their hand and tapped on the glass with one knuckle. Just twice. Soft and almost polite. When I didn't respond, staying frozen in my seat with my fingers white-knuckled around my phone, they tapped again. Same pattern, same weird gentleness. The figure on my driver's side did the exact same thing at the exact same moment. 2 soft taps in perfect synchronization, like they had rehearsed it. That's when I knew this wasn't random, wasn't just some group of criminals who happened upon a broken-down car. This was planned, coordinated, and they had probably done this before. My mind started racing through every option, ramming the van in front even with an overheating engine, trying to drive through the cornfield, screaming even though nobody would hear me, anything to break out of this trap. But before I could act on any of these desperate ideas, all 4 of them stepped back at the same time. Just one step, still maintaining their positions but giving me just enough space that I could theoretically open a door. The one in front raised their hand and made a rolling motion, like they were telling me to start my car and leave. I didn't need to be told twice and turned the key again, begging the universe to let my car start just this once, promising I'd never skip maintenance again, never ignore warning sounds, never drive alone at night through empty highways. The engine turned over once, twice, and then miraculously caught and held, running rough and making terrible sounds but actually running. The temperature gauge immediately shot to the red zone, but I shifted into drive anyway, ready to destroy the engine if it meant getting away from these people. But when I pressed the gas pedal, the car lurched forward maybe 3 feet and then died completely, all the dashboard lights going dark, even the hazard lights clicking off into nothing. The electrical system was completely dead, and this time I knew it wasn't coming back. The 2 vehicles that had trapped me suddenly killed their headlights too, plunging everything into absolute darkness. And for a moment I couldn't see anything at all, couldn't hear anything except my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My phone screen was the only light source now, casting this weak blue glow inside my car, and I held it up trying to see what was happening outside. The 4 figures were gone, or at least I couldn't see them anymore. And for maybe 30 seconds nothing moved, nothing happened. Just me sitting in my dead car in pitch blackness on an empty highway. Then both vehicles started up again simultaneously, their engines roaring to life, but still no lights. Oh. I heard them pulling away, one forward and one backward, their tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. And within seconds, they were accelerating away in opposite directions, driving completely dark on the highway. I sat there shaking, unable to process what had just happened. Still expecting them to come back, still waiting for something horrible that never came. It took me another 10 minutes before I could make myself get out of the car and start walking, using my phone's flashlight to navigate the shoulder, constantly checking behind me every few steps. I walked for almost 2 hours before a state trooper found me, and when I told him what happened, he just nodded like he'd heard this before, and said there had been similar reports from that stretch of 169 over the past few months. They never found any evidence of who these people were, and the trooper told me I was lucky because 2 other drivers who'd broken down on that same stretch in the previous year hadn't been found for days, both of them discovered in their locked cars in various states of psychological trauma, unable or unwilling to explain what had happened to them during the missing time between their breakdown and when they were discovered. The investigators think it's some kind of group that targets vulnerable motorists, maybe doing it for intimidation, maybe for something worse that I was lucky enough to avoid by my car dying completely. I had to get therapy to deal with the nightmares, and even now, 2 years later, I can't drive at night anymore without having a panic attack. I take flights whenever possible, or I plan my routes to only drive during daylight hours with plenty of people around. What haunts me most isn't what happened, but what didn't happen, and what might have happened if my car hadn't died completely, or if I'd gotten out when they were standing around me. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there on that stretch of highway, waiting for the next broken down car, executing their strange ritual for reasons I'll never understand. The Peterbilt's engine had been making this weird rattling noise for the past 100 miles. Nothing serious, but enough to keep me on edge during that November 2023 haul. My 39-year-old body already felt like it belonged to someone twice my age. Too many years bouncing around in truck cabs, eating gas station food, sleeping in rest areas. I was moving agricultural equipment from Omaha to Denver, a route that usually took me about 10 hours if everything went smooth. Nancy had packed those beef sandwiches she always makes, the ones with the horseradish spread that burns just right, wrapped tight in aluminum foil. I kept thinking about getting home for my daughter Megan's basketball game on Saturday morning. She'd been practicing her free throws all month, and I'd promised to be there this time. The Nebraska rest stop near mile marker 287 sits about 40 miles west of Grand Island. One of those newer facilities built with federal funding that actually has decent lighting and those vending machines that never eat your dollar bills. I pulled in around 3 in the morning, needing to stretch my legs and grab some coffee to push through the last leg to Denver. The parking lot surprised me. At least 15 cars scattered across the regular vehicle section, way more than you'd expect at this hour. Sedans, SUVs, a couple of minivans, different colors and states on the license plates. Sometimes you hit these random clusters of travelers, maybe all avoiding some weather system or construction zone further up the highway. The truck parking area was nearly empty though, just me and 2 other rigs parked way at the far end, their running lights glowing orange in the darkness. I grabbed my jacket from behind the seat, one of those thick Carhartt ones with the quilted lining that Nancy bought me 2 Christmases ago, and headed toward the main building. The cold hit different that night, sharp and dry, the kind that makes your nose hairs freeze up instantly. As I walked past those parked cars, something started bothering me, like when you're trying to remember if you locked your front door but can't quite recall. Every single vehicle had frost on the windshields, that thin layer you get when cars sit for a while in cold weather. But underneath the frost, the glass looked foggy, like they'd all been running recently with people inside. The parking lot lights made everything look washed out and yellowish, creating these long shadows that stretched between the vehicles like dark fingers reaching across the asphalt. The automatic doors whooshed open, and I stepped into that artificial warmth that always smells like old coffee, and industrial cleaner. The place was dead quiet, except for the electrical hum of the vending machines lined up against the far wall, their lights flickering slightly like they always do in these places. I headed straight for the men's room, my boots echoing on those polished concrete floors they put in all these rest stops now. The bathroom door was propped wide open with one of those yellow wet floor cones, but the floors were bone dry. Inside, all the faucets were dripping in this weird synchronized rhythm, like someone had turned them all on just enough to leak at the exact same rate. The mirrors had condensation on them, foggy patches right about face height, as if a bunch of people had been standing there breathing on the glass not too long ago. I did my business quick, that uneasy feeling crawling up my spine like cold fingers. When I went to wash my hands, the soap dispensers were all empty, every single one of them. But there were fresh soap suds still sliding down the sides of the sinks, pink foam from that cheap industrial soap they use. The paper towel dispensers had been pulled open, brown paper streaming down to the floor in long strips, like someone had yanked them out in a hurry. I dried my hands on my jeans and got out of there. Back in the main area, I noticed the information rack near the entrance. All those tourism brochures for local attractions and hotels had been emptied out, the pamphlets scattered across the floor in a trail leading toward the exit doors. But what really got me was the vending machines. Every single item had been selected, the metal coils all turned to their endpoints, but nothing had dropped down. Bags of chips, candy bars, bottles of soda, all hanging there at impossible angles, defying gravity. Something made me walk over to the windows facing the parking lot. Maybe just to confirm what my brain was already screaming at me to acknowledge. Those 15 cars sat there under the yellow lights, and now I could see inside them better. Every single driver's seat was pushed all the way back, like whoever had been driving was either really tall or had needed to get out in a hurry without taking time to adjust anything. The doors, I hadn't noticed it walking in, but now I could see. They were all slightly ajar, not wide open, just cracked maybe an inch or two, interior dome lights off despite the doors being open. That's when I saw the keys. Every single vehicle had its keys still in the ignition, glinting under the parking lot lights. Some of them had those heavy keychains people use, rabbit's feet and bottle openers and little photos in plastic frames, all just dangling there. My mouth went dry and I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears like a drum. I backed away from the window and started moving toward the exit, trying to look casual even though nobody was around to see me. The coffee could wait. Hell, everything could wait. I just needed to get back to my truck and get out of there. But as I pushed through those automatic doors, the cold air hit me along with something else. A smell like burning rubber mixed with something sweet. Almost like caramel, but wrong somehow. Synthetic. The parking lot seemed darker now, even though nothing had changed, and I could hear this low humming sound, barely audible, like 100 people humming the same note just below the range of normal hearing. My boots crunched on something as I walked. Broken pieces of cell phones, dozens of them, scattered across the asphalt like someone had taken a hammer to a phone store display. I picked up my pace, almost jogging now toward my Peterbilt, fumbling for my keys with numb fingers. The two other trucks I'd seen earlier were still there, but now I noticed their doors were open too. Cabs dark, no sign of the drivers. As I passed that cluster of abandoned cars, I could see more details that made my gut clench. Purses left on passenger seats, coffee cups still steaming in cup holders, a baby's car seat with the straps undone and hanging loose. One minivan had a DVD player still running in the back, some cartoon playing on repeat, the glow from the screen casting blue shadows through the frosted windows. The Nebraska license plates, Iowa, Colorado, Wyoming, all different places, but every single car had the same thing, a parking receipt from this rest stop tucked under the windshield wiper, all time stamped within the last hour. How the hell do 15 different groups of people all disappear within an hour? I reached my truck and grabbed the door handle, ready to climb up into safety, when I heard it, the distinct sound of car engines turning over, one after another, like dominoes falling. But nobody was starting them. I turned around slowly. my breath coming out in quick white puffs in the cold air, and watched as every single abandoned car in that parking lot came to life. Not roaring to life, just idling, that low purr of engines warming up. The headlights stayed off though, and the cars just sat there running in the dark like they were waiting for something. Then I noticed the steam starting to rise from their exhaust pipes, thick white clouds in the freezing air, but the smoke wasn't drifting away like it should. It was moving sideways, creeping along the ground toward my truck like morning fog. Except fog doesn't move with purpose, doesn't seem to reach for you. That's when the radios turned on. Every car radio, all at once, but not playing music or talk shows. It was voices, dozens of different voices all talking at the same time but not to each other, like recorded conversations played simultaneously. I could make out fragments as I stood there paralyzed. Someone ordering lunch, a woman singing happy birthday, a man arguing about a football game, a child asking to stop for the bathroom. Normal conversations, everyday stuff, but all cut up and overlapping in this horrible cacophony that made my teeth ache. The smell got stronger, that burnt rubber and fake sweet combination that made me want to gag. And underneath all those voices from the radios, I could hear something else. Breathing. Synchronized breathing, like when you're in a quiet room and suddenly become aware of your own breath. Except this was coming from inside those empty cars, from seats that I could clearly see had nobody in them. My hands finally found the truck door handle, and I yanked myself up into the cab, slamming the door behind me hard enough to rattle the whole vehicle. My fingers fumbled with the keys, missing the ignition twice before finally getting them in. The Peterbilt roared to life, that familiar diesel rumble that usually comforted me now sounding too loud, too obvious. Through my windshield, I watched as every single headlight in that parking lot flicked on at the exact same moment. All of them pointed directly at my truck. Not just the front headlights, the brake lights, the reverse lights, the fog lights. Every possible light on those vehicles blazed to life, bathing my cab in this harsh, blinding white and red glow that made shadows dance across my dashboard like living things. The voices on the radios got louder, more frantic, overlapping into this wall of human sound that penetrated right through my closed windows. And then, just as I slammed the truck into gear, I saw them in my side mirrors, people standing behind each car, perfectly still, all facing my truck. But when I turned to look directly, nothing. Check the mirror again. They were there. Look back. Empty parking lot. I gunned it out of there, probably taking that exit turn faster than any 18-wheeler should. Tires screaming against the asphalt. In my rearview mirror, those lights followed me, not the cars, just the lights, staying at the exact same distance no matter how hard I pushed the accelerator. They stayed with me for maybe 5 miles down Interstate 80 before suddenly cutting out all at once, leaving me in complete darkness, except for my own headlights cutting through the Nebraska night. I didn't stop driving until I hit Denver. Didn't even pull over to check that rattling sound in the engine that had gotten worse during my escape. When I finally got to the delivery point and told my dispatcher about what happened, he laughed and said, I must have dozed off and had a nightmare. But I know what I saw. I know those people in the mirrors were real. And I know that 3 days later, when I looked up news for that area, there were reports of 17 vehicles found abandoned at that same rest stop, all with their engines running, keys in the ignition, and no sign of the drivers or passengers. The reports said it was probably human trafficking or some coordinated crime, but they never found anyone, never found any bodies, never found any explanation. I never took that route again. Told my dispatcher I'd quit before driving through Nebraska after dark, and I meant it. Nancy thinks I had some kind of breakdown, maybe a panic attack from too many hours on the road. And I let her believe that because it's easier than trying to explain what really happened. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night on any empty highway, I'll catch a glimpse of headlights in my mirror that seem to be following at the exact same distance for too long, and I have to pull over at the next truck stop, wait it out with other drivers around, pretending to check my logs or grab coffee until the feeling passes. I still drive for a living. Bills don't pay themselves. But I plan my routes different now, always making sure I'm near populated areas when 3 in the morning rolls around. And I never, ever stop at rest areas when there are too many cars, but no people. That's the thing that still keeps me up some nights, turning it over in my mind like a puzzle with missing pieces. Where did all those people go? What were those things I saw standing behind the cars that only existed in reflections? About a month ago, another trucker named Glenn told me something at a Flying J outside Denver that made my blood turn to ice water. He said his cousin drives that same stretch of Interstate 80, and one night around 3 in the morning, he saw a bunch of abandoned trucks at that same rest stop. Big rigs like mine, doors open, engines running, nobody around. But here's the thing that really got me. Glenn's cousin said he saw someone in his mirror walking between the trucks, checking each cab like they were looking for something specific. When he turned to look directly, the parking lot was empty. But in the mirror, clear as day, the figure kept searching, kept moving from truck to truck with this methodical patience that made him floor it out of there without looking back. We compared dates. It was exactly 1 month after my experience, down to the day. Glenn's cousin won't drive that route anymore either. Makes you wonder how many of us have seen things at that rest stop, how many have kept quiet because nobody would believe us anyway. All I know is that place isn't right. And whatever's happening there, it's still happening. Still hunting, still collecting. My headlights caught her in that strange way where everything else disappears into darkness. She was standing on the shoulder of Route 47, both arms raised high above her head, waving in these big, sweeping motions like she was trying to flag down a plane instead of a car. The dashboard clock showed 3:17 a.m., and I'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes since leaving the hospital parking garage, my scrubs still smelling like disinfectant, and that weird metallic scent that clings to you after 12 hours in the respiratory unit. Being 29 means you think you're invincible, that nothing bad can happen to you, especially when you've dealt with life and death situations all night. But seeing this woman out there, completely alone on this stretch of highway that runs through nothing but abandoned warehouses and overgrown fields, made something in my chest tighten up. I remember gripping the steering wheel harder, my knuckles going white while I debated what to do. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to keep driving, to call 911 once I got further down the road, let someone else deal with it. But she looked so desperate, and I kept thinking about my sister Katie, how she'd broken down on a similar road last year, and nobody stopped for 3 hours. The woman was wearing dark clothes, a navy blazer that looked expensive even from a distance, nice jeans, not the kind of outfit you'd expect from someone dangerous. Her blonde hair was shoulder length, neat despite the wind from passing semis, so I did what I probably shouldn't have done. I slowed down, checked my mirrors for any other cars lurking nearby, and pulled over about 50 feet ahead of her, keeping my engine running and my phone in my lap with 911 already dialed but not yet called. She jogged up to my passenger window, and I only rolled it down about 3 inches, just enough to hear her speak. Up close, she was maybe 45, with one of those faces that probably looked younger in better lighting. Her makeup was perfect though, which struck me as odd for someone stranded at 3 in the morning. No smeared mascara from crying, no signs of distress on her face at all. She smiled at me, this calm, almost serene expression that didn't match the frantic waving from moments before. "Thank you so much for stopping," she said, her voice steady and pleasant, like we were meeting at a coffee shop instead of on a dark highway. My car broke down about a mile back, and my phone died. I just need a ride to the next exit where I can call someone. Her explanation made sense, but something about her demeanor set off every alarm bell in my head. Still, I unlocked the door. God knows why. Maybe because turning away someone who looked so normal, so put together, felt cruel. She slid into the passenger seat with this fluid grace, closing the door gently behind her, and immediately the car filled with her perfume, something floral and heavy that reminded me of funeral homes. I pulled back onto the highway, accelerating slowly while trying to make conversation to ease my nerves. Asked her what happened to her car, and she said something vague about the engine making weird noises before it just stopped. Asked where she was headed before breaking down, and she said she was visiting family but didn't specify where. Every answer was like that, polite, reasonable on the surface, but completely empty of any real information. The next exit was only about 10 miles away, but those were going to be the longest 10 miles of my life. I kept glancing at her in my peripheral vision, and she just sat there, hands folded neatly in her lap, staring straight ahead through the windshield with that same subtle smile playing at the corners of her mouth. About 5 minutes into the drive, I reached over to adjust my rearview mirror because a semi was coming up behind us with its high beams on. That's when I noticed it. The side mirror on the passenger side showed the empty seat, just the beige fabric of my car's interior, the seatbelt hanging loose, nothing else. But she was right there. I could see her in my peripheral vision, could smell that overwhelming perfume, could hear her breathing in this measured, deliberate way. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the angle, maybe the darkness was playing tricks, maybe I was more exhausted than I thought. I adjusted the mirror slightly, tilted my head different ways, but no matter what I did, the reflection showed an empty seat. My heart started hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, this thick, wet pounding that made it hard to focus on the road. "Is everything all right?" she asked, and her voice sounded different now, lower, with this weird echo quality like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and forced myself to look straight ahead, told her everything was fine, just tired from my shift. She made this humming sound, not quite agreement, not quite anything really, just this low vibration that seemed to fill the entire car. The temperature dropped suddenly, or maybe that was just me going cold with fear, but I could see my breath coming out in little puffs even though it was August, and the AC wasn't even on that high. I started doing the math in my head. 5 more miles to the exit, maybe 6 minutes if I sped up a little. But when I pressed harder on the gas pedal, the speedometer didn't budge. We were still going exactly 55, no matter how hard I pressed down. That's when she started talking. Not to me exactly, but just talking in this monotone voice about the strangest things. "People leave pieces of themselves everywhere they go," she said, her head still facing forward, never turning to look at me. "In their cars, in their homes, in the places they work. Little fragments of who they are, what they've done, what they're going to do. Sometimes those pieces get picked up by others. Sometimes they get carried forward. I had no idea how to respond to that, so I just kept driving, watching the mile markers pass by with agonizing slowness." She continued, "You left something at the hospital tonight. Not equipment, not belongings, something else. And now you're carrying something that isn't yours." My mouth went completely dry. I wanted to ask her what she meant, wanted to scream at her to get out of my car, but my voice wouldn't work. It was like my throat had sealed itself shut. The exit sign finally came into view. Exit 42, with a gas station logo and a promise of food and lodging. Relief washed over me so intensely that I almost sobbed. I put on my turn signal, started to ease into the exit lane, and that's when she placed her hand on the dashboard. Not on my arm, not reaching for the wheel, just flat against the dashboard. Her hand was wrong. The fingers were too long, bent at angles that shouldn't have been possible, and the skin had this translucent quality where I could see dark veins pulsing underneath. "Not this exit," she said calmly. "The next one." But there was no next exit for another 15 miles. I knew this highway like the back of my hand, had driven it hundreds of times. My foot moved to the brake anyway, started to slow down for the exit, and she made this clicking sound with her tongue, sharp and disapproving like you'd make at a misbehaving dog. I jerked the wheel hard to the right, tires screaming as I veered into the exit lane despite her protests. The moment I did, she went completely silent. Not just quiet. It was like all sound in the car had been sucked out, creating this vacuum that made my ears pop painfully. I risked a glance at the passenger seat and found it empty. Completely. Absolutely empty. The seatbelt was still buckled somehow, stretched across nothing, and that overwhelming perfume smell had vanished instantly. But the passenger door was hanging wide open, swinging back and forth even though we were moving at 40 miles an hour. The interior light was on, illuminating the seat, and there was something lying there. A phone. At first I thought she'd left her phone behind, but as I pulled into the gas station parking lot with shaking legs, I realized it looked exactly like mine. Same case, same cracked corner from when I dropped it last month. Same hospital parking sticker on the back. I slammed on the brakes under the bright canopy lights of the gas station, my real phone still in the cup holder where I'd left it. But this other phone, this duplicate, was lit up and active. The screen showed my GPS app tracking my exact location in real time, following the little blue dot that represented my car. The location history showed everywhere I'd been that night. The hospital, the route I'd taken, even the spot where I'd picked her up. But there were other locations too, places I'd never been, timestamps for the future, for later today, tomorrow, next week. Places called Riverside Memorial Gardens, Bennett Funeral Home, plots with numbers instead of names. My throat constricted as I picked up the phone with trembling fingers, and that's when I saw the last destination programmed into it, set for 4:47 a.m., just 20 minutes from now. It was my apartment address, but the label on it simply said, "Collection Point." I threw both phones onto the passenger floor and ran into the gas station, practically colliding with the glass doors in my panic. The teenager behind the counter looked up from his phone, startled by this woman in wrinkled scrubs bursting in like a maniac. I must have looked insane, trying to explain that someone had been in my car but wasn't really there, that she'd left a phone that was mine but wasn't mine. He just stared at me, suggested maybe I should call the police, which I did. 2 officers showed up about 10 minutes later, probably expecting to deal with a psychiatric case or someone high on something. They checked my car, found the duplicate phone right where I'd thrown it, and their expressions changed immediately. Turns out, they'd been getting similar reports all week. Women picking up other women on various highways around the state, always late at night, always with the same story about a broken-down car. The passengers would vanish, leaving behind these duplicate phones with disturbing GPS data. 3 of the women who'd reported it had died within days. Sudden brain aneurysms, unexplained organ failure, things that shouldn't happen to healthy people in their 20s and 30s. The officers took the duplicate phone as evidence and followed me home, insisted on checking my apartment before I went in. Everything looked normal, nothing out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. I called in sick for the next week, stayed with my sister Katie in another state, trying to make sense of what happened. The duplicate phone was never explained. The police said the GPS data was impossible, that the phone shouldn't have been able to predict future locations like that. They never found any woman matching the description I gave. No abandoned cars on that stretch of highway. 6 days later, I got a call from the police. Another woman had picked up the same passenger, or something that looked like her, on a completely different highway 3 states away. That woman didn't make it to the gas station. They found her car on the side of the road, engine still running, both doors open. 2 phones in the front seat showing the same impossible GPS data. She was in the driver's seat, unconscious but alive, and when she woke up in the hospital, she had no memory of the last 3 years of her life. Just gone, like they'd been deleted. I still work at the hospital, still drive home late at night, but I never stop for anyone anymore. And sometimes, when I'm checking my GPS, I see locations I've never been to flash across the screen for just a second before disappearing. Places I hope I'll never have to visit, at least not while I'm still breathing. "5 months ago, turning 36 had made me realize my life consisted of endless miles of asphalt and the hum of 18 wheels against pavement. Trucking paid the bills, kept me moving from state to state, hauling everything from furniture to frozen goods. That particular week in early May, had me driving a load of electronics from Phoenix to Chicago, a route that usually took me through some pretty desolate stretches of highway. My marriage had fallen apart 6 months prior, and honestly, the solitude of the road felt like exactly what I needed. The cab of my Peterbilt had become more of a home than my actual apartment back in Tucson. That night, the one that still makes me check my mirrors more than necessary, started like any other long haul through the desert. The fuel gauge had been hovering near empty for the last 20 miles, and finding a station open at 2 in the morning on Highway 89 wasn't exactly easy. When the faded Shell sign finally appeared through the darkness, glowing like a beacon against the black desert sky, relief washed over me. The place looked ancient, one of those stations that probably hadn't been renovated since the 70s, with just 2 pumps and a small convenience store attached. No other vehicles sat in the lot, which wasn't unusual for that hour and location. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, casting an uneven glow across the cracked concrete. I pulled the rig in carefully, mindful of the tight space, and killed the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant hum of the store's ancient air conditioning unit, struggling against the desert heat. I grabbed my wallet from the center console and climbed down from the cab, my joints protesting after 4 hours of straight driving. The desert air hit me immediately, still warm despite the early hour, carrying that distinctive smell of creosote and dust. My boots crunched against loose gravel as I walked to the pump, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Through the store window, I could make out the silhouette of someone behind the counter, barely visible through the grime-covered glass. The pump itself looked older than me, one of those analog models where you could actually hear the fuel rushing through the hose. I started filling up, leaning against the truck while the numbers slowly climbed on the display. 40 gallons, 50, 60. Big rigs drink fuel like nothing else, and this would probably cost me close to $300. Inside the store, the clerk hadn't moved once since I'd arrived. Even from outside, I could tell something was wrong with his posture, the way he stood rigid behind that counter, his head slightly tilted like he was listening for something. The fluorescent light above him kept cutting out for split seconds, making him appear and disappear like frames missing from an old film reel. When the pump finally clicked off at 78 gallons, I hung up the nozzle and headed toward the door. The closer I got, the more details I could make out through the window. Young guy, maybe early 20s, wearing a faded red Shell uniform that hung loose on his thin frame. His face was pale, almost gray under those harsh lights, and his eyes kept darting to the door, then back to the counter, then to the door again. The bell above the entrance gave a weak chime as I pushed inside, and the kid practically jumped out of his skin. "Just the diesel," I said, trying to keep my voice casual despite the weird vibe in the place. The store smelled like old coffee and something else, something metallic that reminded me of blood, but could have been rusty pipes. The kid nodded quickly, his fingers trembling as he punched numbers into the ancient register. His name tag read Aaron in faded letters, and up close I could see dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. Behind him, a security monitor showed grainy footage of the parking lot, but the screen kept jumping and distorting, making it impossible to see anything clearly. $312.47, Aaron whispered, his voice barely audible. His eyes flicked to the door again, then to me, then back to the door. I handed him my credit card, and when our fingers brushed during the exchange, his skin felt ice cold despite the warmth of the night. While he ran the card, I noticed his other hand gripping the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles had turned white. The receipt printer screeched to life, making him flinch violently. Every sound seemed to terrify him. The hum of the refrigerators, the buzz of the lights, even his own breathing, which came in short, shallow gasps. "You traveling alone?" he asked suddenly, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. Before I could answer, he leaned forward slightly, glancing toward the door again. "Don't matter, just, when you leave, drive fast. Don't stop for nothing." He pushed the receipt across the counter with shaking fingers. I was about to ask what he meant when he grabbed my wrist. His grip was desperate, urgent. "And don't open that door again," he whispered, his voice cracking. Once you're out, just go, please." The intensity in his eyes made my chest tighten. This wasn't some joke or local trying to mess with an outsider. I pulled my hand back, pocketed the receipt, and headed for the door without another word. Whatever was happening here, the kid's fear was real enough to make me want to get back on the road immediately. The bell chimed again as I pushed outside, and I heard Aaron let out a sound behind me, something between a whimper and a prayer. The walk back to my truck felt longer than before, the darkness beyond the station's lights seeming to press in from all sides. I climbed up into the cab quickly, locked the doors, and started the engine. The diesel rumbled to life, a comforting sound after the strangeness inside that store. I was just putting the truck in gear when I heard it. A soft knocking on the glass of the passenger door. 3 deliberate taps, patient and measured. My head snapped toward the sound, but the parking lot lights didn't reach that side of the cab. All I could see in the window was blackness. Then a voice, clear despite the running engine, came from outside the passenger door. "Come on, Richard, open up. We need to talk." My entire body went rigid. Richard. That voice had just said my name. My actual name that I hadn't told anyone at this stop, that wasn't on any paperwork visible in the cab, that the kid inside definitely hadn't used. The credit card I'd paid with was a company card under the trucking firm's name, not mine. My CDL was tucked away in my wallet. There was absolutely no way anyone here could know my name. The knock came again, still gentle, almost friendly. "Richard, I know you can hear me. Just crack the window, 5 minutes, that's all I need." The voice sounded normal, masculine, maybe middle-aged, with no accent I could place. But there was something underneath the words, something that made every instinct scream at me not to look, not to respond, just drive. I slammed the truck into first gear and started rolling forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the side mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure stepping back from the truck, tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark suit. Who wears a suit in the middle of the desert at 2 in the morning? The figure didn't chase after the truck, just stood there watching as I pulled away. "Richard, you're making this harder than it needs to be," the voice called out, somehow still audible over the diesel engine. "I'll be seeing you at the next stop, mile marker 277. You know you have to stop there." My throat went dry. Mile marker 277 was the way station, mandatory for all commercial vehicles. If I skipped it, I'd have Dati on my ass within hours, probably lose my CDL. But how did this person know my route? How did they know I'd have to stop there? I hit the highway doing 70, way over the limit for a loaded rig, but I didn't care. In the rearview mirror, the gas station lights faded into the distance, swallowed by the desert darkness. My phone, mounted on the dashboard, showed 2:23 a.m. The way station was maybe 40 miles ahead, less than an hour at this speed. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see headlights following, but the road remained empty. Just me, the yellow lines, and miles of nothing. Then I noticed something that made my grip tighten on the wheel. The GPS on my phone was showing my name at the top of the screen, Richard's route, something I'd never programmed, never seen before. I reached over to check the settings, and that's when I saw the recent search history wasn't mine. Addresses I'd never looked up. My ex-wife's new apartment in Flagstaff, my mother's nursing home in Albuquerque, my daughter's college dorm at ASU. Places this person, whoever they were, wanted me to know they knew about. The mile markers counted down like a timer on a bomb. 251, 250, 249, each one bringing me closer to that way station where he said he'd be waiting. I tried calling 911, but my phone showed no service despite having full bars just minutes before. The radio in the truck produced only static, no matter which channel I tried. Even the CB, usually full of late-night chatter from other truckers, was dead silent. It felt like I was driving through a bubble, cut off from the rest of the world. At mile marker 265, I made a decision. There was a truck stop at exit 38, a big flying J that would have people, witnesses, maybe even security. I could park there, wait until daylight, figure out what to do. But as I approached the exit, my foot wouldn't move to the brake pedal. I pressed down hard, but nothing happened. The pedal felt normal, had resistance, but the truck kept maintaining exactly 70 miles per hour. The steering wheel turned freely. I could change lanes, but I couldn't slow down, couldn't take the exit. Panic started creeping up my spine as I watched the Flying J pass by in a blur of lights. Whatever was happening, whoever this person was, they had control of my truck somehow. The electronics, the brakes, probably the accelerator too. Modern trucks are all computer-controlled, and someone with the right knowledge could hack into the systems. But doing it while the truck was moving, from a distance? That was something else entirely. Mile marker 277 appeared in my headlights like a tombstone. The weigh station sat just ahead, its inspection lanes empty, the office building dark except for a single light in the front window. As my truck began to slow on its own, finally responding to my desperate pumping of the brakes, I saw him. The same tall figure in the dark suit standing next to a black sedan parked beside the scale house. He raised one hand in a casual wave, like we were old friends meeting for coffee. My truck rolled to a stop exactly where it needed to for the weigh-in, and the engine died without me turning the key. The man walked toward my truck with measured steps, his face becoming clearer under the overhead lights. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, unremarkable features except for his eyes. They were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost white. He stopped at my door and knocked 3 times, the same patient rhythm from before. "Richard, please step out of the vehicle. We have business to discuss regarding your cargo." My cargo? I was hauling electronics, nothing special, just TVs and computers for a Best Buy distribution center. Through the side mirror, I watched him pull out what looked like a small tablet, its screen glowing green in the darkness. "Your manifest says electronics," he continued, his voice carrying perfectly through the closed door. "But we both know there's an extra package in there, serial number X74429. You weren't supposed to know about it, but plans have changed." I had no idea what he was talking about, but something in his tone made me check the sleeper compartment behind my seat. There, wedged between my duffel bag and the back wall, was a metal briefcase I'd never seen before, secured with electronic locks, a small red light blinking steadily on its surface. The man must have seen my expression change because he smiled, a thin stretching of lips that didn't reach those pale eyes. "Previous driver put it there yesterday when you stopped in Phoenix. You've been carrying it for 300 miles without knowing. Now you have 2 choices. Give me the case and drive away, forget this ever happened, go back to your life. Or refuse, and, well," he pulled out a phone, showed me the screen. Security camera footage of my daughter walking into her dorm room, time-stamped from 3 hours ago. "Rebecca's studying for her chemistry midterm right now, room 314, Preston Hall. She keeps her window cracked because the heater runs too hot." My blood turned to ice. The decision wasn't really a choice at all. With shaking fingers, I reached back, grabbed the briefcase, and climbed down from the cab. The moment my feet hit the pavement, my truck's engine roared back to life on its own, the doors locking automatically. I handed him the case, and he examined it briefly, checking the seals, verifying something on his tablet. "Smart man," he said, already walking back to his sedan. "Your truck will start working normally once I'm gone. And Richard, don't stop at any more gas stations tonight. Take Interstate 40 straight through to Amarillo. Aaron at the Shell station. He won't make it through his shift if you go back." The sedan pulled away, disappearing into the desert darkness, and true to his word, my truck returned to normal. I drove straight through to Chicago, delivered my legitimate cargo, and never said a word about what happened. But I did check the news 3 days later. A young gas station clerk named Aaron Vasquez was found dead at a Shell station on Highway 89. Apparent heart attack, even though he was only 23 years old. That was 5 months ago, and I've since changed routes, only driving daylight hours now. Sometimes I wonder what was in that case, who that man really was, but mostly I'm just grateful my daughter is safe. Still calling me every Sunday, still complaining about her dorm room being too hot. The CB radio in my Ford pickup hadn't picked up another driver for hours, just static echoing through Copper Canyon's winding roads. Sandra had called me 2 days earlier about clearing out the rest of my stuff from her place in Utah. Apparently her new boyfriend needed the garage space. Fine by me. I'd been making these furniture runs every few months since the divorce papers were signed, and this Monday night in March was just another trip with another loaded trailer swaying behind my truck. The canyon walls rose up on both sides, ancient rock formations that blocked out most of the sky, except for a narrow strip where clouds covered any trace of moonlight. My supervisor at the warehouse had given me until Wednesday to get back, which meant I could take the old canyon route instead of dealing with the interstate construction zones. 14 hours into the drive, running on nothing but gas station coffee and whatever energy drinks I could find, I kept checking my mirrors to make sure the trailer stayed centered on these sharp curves. A woman's voice suddenly cut through the static on Channel 19, each word coming through clear despite the interference around the edges. "Hello? Can anyone hear me? There's been an accident. We need help. Please, if anyone can hear this, we're just off mile marker 17, about 50 feet down the embankment on the north side. My husband's unconscious and I think his leg is broken. The car rolled twice before it stopped. Please, somebody help us." Something about her tone made my skin prickle. She sounded like she was ordering takeout, not reporting that her car had just tumbled down a mountainside. The calmness in her voice, the way she rattled off those specific details without any panic or tears, it all felt rehearsed somehow. But 40 miles from the nearest town, with these canyon walls blocking any cell signal, you couldn't just drive past someone asking for help. I grabbed the handset while navigating another hairpin turn, knowing mile marker 17 was maybe 3 miles ahead based on the last sign I'd noticed. Against every warning bell going off in my head, I pressed the talk button. "This is eastbound traffic on 19. I hear you loud and clear. I'm about 3 miles out from marker 17. Hang tight, I'm coming to help. Can you tell me what color your car is? Any injuries besides your husband?" My voice echoed back through the speaker for a second before she responded, and when she did, there was this weird delay, like she was thinking about each word before saying it. "Thank you so much for responding. It's a silver sedan, a newer model Toyota. The front end is completely smashed in. I'm okay, just some cuts and bruises, but my husband, he won't wake up. There's blood coming from his head, and his left leg is bent at an angle that doesn't look right. Please hurry." The transmission cut out with a sharp click, and I pushed harder on the accelerator, making the trailer lurch dangerously on the next curve. Something kept nagging at me, though. She never said her name, never mentioned trying to flag down other cars, never asked me to call for an ambulance once I got to somewhere with cell service. Mile marker 16 flew past my window, and I started scanning the shoulder for any sign of an accident scene, my high beams cutting through the darkness ahead. When 17 finally appeared in my headlights, I pulled over as far as I could without risking the trailer sliding off the narrow shoulder, grabbed my flashlight from under the seat, and stepped out into the cold mountain air. The silence hit me immediately. No sound of settling metal, no hiss of a damaged radiator, nothing but the tick of my own engine cooling and the wind whistling through the canyon. I walked along the guardrail, sweeping my flashlight beam down the embankment on the north side, and that's when I saw them. Fresh tire marks on the asphalt, leading straight toward the edge. The guardrail had a decent-sized dent in it, with white paint transfer that looked recent, and when I leaned over to look down, I could see broken glass scattered across the rocks about 20 feet below. But beyond that, nothing. A silver Toyota. No injured passengers, just empty darkness stretching down into the canyon. I spent the next 20 minutes climbing down that embankment, using my flashlight to check every possible spot where a car could have landed. The broken glass formed a trail that led about 50 feet down, exactly where she'd said, but then it just stopped. No skid marks in the dirt, no crushed bushes, no oil stains on the rocks, nothing to indicate a 2-ton vehicle had rolled through here. My boots kept slipping on the loose gravel, and twice I had to grab onto the scraggly pine trees growing out of the cliff face to keep from tumbling down myself. The whole time, I kept thinking about how specific her description had been, how she knew exactly how far down they'd gone. When I finally climbed back up to the road, winded and covered in dirt, I found another driver had stopped behind my truck, an older guy in a Peterbilt who'd seen my hazard lights. "Everything all right, buddy?" he called out, walking toward me with his own flashlight. "Saw your rig parked here and thought you might have trouble with that trailer." I explained about the CB call, the woman asking for help, and he got this look on his face that made my stomach tighten. "Silver Toyota, you said? Young woman, calm voice, husband with a broken leg?" The way he repeated those details, I knew he'd heard the same broadcast. "Got that call about an hour ago when I was heading westbound. Came through clear as day on 19. Thing is, I was talking to my dispatcher right after on a different channel, and he said 3 other drivers had reported the same call tonight, all at different times. Each one stopped to look, and each one found exactly what you found. Evidence of a crash, but no car." He pointed at the tire marks with his light, then at the damaged guardrail. "These marks were here when I passed through this afternoon before sunset. Whatever happened here, it wasn't tonight." We were both standing there trying to make sense of it when the CB radio in my truck crackled to life again. The woman's voice came through the open window, but this time it was different, quieter, more intimate, like she was speaking directly into the microphone. "Thank you for stopping, but you're too late. We've been down here for so long, waiting in the cold. The metal is twisted around us like fingers, and the engine block is pressing against his chest. Can you hear him breathing? Listen carefully." Then came this wet, ragged sound that made both of us step back from the truck. It went on for maybe 10 seconds, irregular and labored before cutting to dead air. The trucker grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in through my jacket. "That ain't coming from no accident scene, friend. I've pulled people from wrecks before and nobody pinned under an engine block sounds like that. We need to get out of here." But then she spoke again, and this time she said something that made every hair on my body stand straight up. "Jerome, I know you're listening. You can't leave us again, Jerome. Not like you did in Utah. Sandra tried to warn you about taking this route, didn't she? She knew what happened here. Check your glove box, Jerome. Check what she packed for you." My legs nearly gave out when I heard my name. Not my handle, not eastbound driver, but my actual name. The trucker was already backing toward his rig, shaking his head and muttering something about not getting paid enough for this. But I couldn't move. Nobody on this road knew my name. I hadn't given it over the radio, hadn't stopped anywhere since crossing the state line. And Sandra, she'd insisted I take some of my old things from the garage, practically forced a box of junk on me that I'd tossed in the passenger seat without looking. My hands trembled as I reached for the truck door, the sound of the Peterbilt's engine roaring to life behind me as the other driver took off without another word. Inside the cab, the dome light seemed too dim, casting shadows that moved wrong across the dashboard. The glove box latch felt cold under my fingers, and when I opened it, a manila envelope fell out onto the floor, one I'd never seen before. Sandra's handwriting was on the front. "Jerome, you need to know the truth about Copper Canyon." Inside were newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, dated from 6 years ago. The headline on the first one read, "Couple missing after canyon crash," with a photo that knocked the breath out of me. It was me, but younger, standing next to a woman I'd never seen before beside a silver Toyota. The article said Jerome Hutchinson and his wife Valerie had disappeared after their car went off the road at mile marker 17. Their bodies never recovered. But that was impossible. 6 years ago, I was living in Colorado, working construction, had never even been to this canyon before meeting Sandra. I grabbed the next clipping with numb fingers. Search called off for missing couple. And there was another photo, this one from a security camera at a gas station. Clear as day, it showed me filling up that same silver Toyota, the timestamp reading 3 days before the accident. The woman from the photo, Valerie, was visible through the passenger window. More clippings, more evidence of a life I'd never lived, a marriage I'd never had, a death that hadn't happened. The last item in the envelope was a note in Sandra's writing. "I found these in your things when we met. You said you didn't remember, that sometimes whole chunks of your past just weren't there. I should have told you sooner, but I was scared. Don't go through that canyon, Jerome. She's still waiting for you there." The CB crackled again, and this time the voice was barely a whisper, close and personal, like lips pressed against the microphone. "Jerome, stop reading those lies. You know who I am. You remember the way my hair smelled like vanilla, the scar on my palm from when I tried to cook you dinner on our anniversary. You remember the song that was playing when we crashed, our song. Turn the radio to FM 93.5. It's playing right now." My finger moved toward the radio dial without conscious thought, like muscle memory taking over, and I had to physically grab my wrist with my other hand to stop myself. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible, that I needed to drive away now, but my hand kept reaching for that dial. When I finally switched it over, static filled the cab for a moment, before a song faded in. Wonderwall by Oasis. The moment those opening chords hit, something cracked inside my skull like ice breaking on a frozen lake, and memories that weren't supposed to exist came flooding through. Valerie laughing in the passenger seat, singing off-key. The argument about her sister, the deer that jumped in front of us, the way the guardrail bent like paper when we hit it, her screaming my name as we went over. The silence after the rolling stopped. But underneath those memories were my other life, meeting Sandra 2 years ago at a bar in Albuquerque, our wedding, the divorce, the warehouse job. 2 complete histories existing in one mind, and I couldn't tell which one was real anymore. The woman on the CB spoke one more time. "I'm still in the car, Jerome. I never left. You did. You crawled out and walked away, and you forgot about me. But every time you drive through here, I try to bring you back. Come down to the car, come back to me. We can leave together this time." I looked down at my hands and saw blood under my fingernails that hadn't been there before, old and dried and flaking off. The newspaper clippings were dissolving in my lap, the ink running like water, forming new words. "You left her to die. You left her to die. You left her to die." I slammed the truck into gear and floored it, the trailer fishtailing wildly as I tore away from mile marker 17. The CB radio kept crackling with her voice, pleading, crying, then angry and screaming my name. But I reached over and ripped the power cord out of the dashboard. The silence that followed was almost worse. In my rearview mirror, I swear I could see headlights rising up from the embankment. Impossible headlights from a car that couldn't exist, following me through every curve. I drove for 3 straight hours without stopping, pushing that old Ford harder than I ever had, until I finally saw the lights of a 24-hour diner near the state line. I pulled in, parked under the brightest light I could find, and sat there until dawn, going through my wallet, my phone, looking for any proof of who I really was. Every photo of Sandra and me was real. My driver's license was real. The divorce papers were real. But so were the scars on my ribs that I'd never noticed before, the ones that looked like they came from a steering wheel impact. I made it home to New Mexico that morning and immediately went to the courthouse to pull public records. Jerome Hutchinson, my name, my social security number, had no death certificate, no missing person report, no record of ever being married to anyone named Valerie. But I found something else in the newspaper archives from 6 years ago. A small article about an unidentified woman's body found in a ravine near Copper Canyon, discovered by hikers months after an apparent car accident. Silver Toyota, partial plate matching what would have been mine if I'd lived in Utah then. She was wearing a wedding ring, but they never found out who she was. The article mentioned that investigators believed there might have been a passenger who walked away from the crash, based on blood evidence found leading up to the road. They never found him. I've never driven through Copper Canyon again, and I won't. I traded in my truck, got rid of the CB radio, moved to a different apartment. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear static that sounds like someone trying to speak. And sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see dried blood under my fingernails that takes forever to wash away. The night had bled into early morning by the time I clocked out from the hospital. My brain was foggy from 12 straight hours of trauma cases, and the only thing I could think about was coffee and a warm shower. The city was still asleep when I started driving home, and for the first few miles, everything felt routine. Then my GPS screen blinked, froze, and restarted with that soft chime I'd heard 1,000 times before. Only this time, it never came back online. I figured I knew the way well enough, but somewhere after the second intersection, I must have turned onto the wrong road. It did not look like any road I had taken before. The asphalt gave way to cracked pavement and then to gravel, flanked by tall weeds that brushed the sides of my car. The sky had started to pale, but there was no hint of dawn warmth, just that dull bluish light that makes everything look abandoned. The radio was dead too. Nothing but static. I kept telling myself it was fine, that I'd hit the highway again soon. But after 20 minutes of driving past nameless turns and sagging mailboxes, I realized I hadn't seen another car at all. When the gas light blinked on, I finally spotted a small gas station just ahead, a single row of pumps, a flickering sign, and a convenience store with the metal shutters halfway down. The lot was empty. I pulled in anyway, parked near the pumps, and stepped out to stretch my legs. The air was colder than I expected, the kind of damp chill that clings to you even through your scrubs. I tried opening my phone's map again, but it showed me floating in a gray void, no roads, no landmarks. That's when I noticed the houses behind the station. They were lined along the opposite side of the road, maybe half a dozen of them, all spaced far apart. Every single one had its lights on. Porch lamps, living room windows, even bedrooms glowing behind drawn curtains. And every front door I could see stood wide open. At first, I thought it was some kind of small-town quirk, maybe early risers or night shift workers like me. But there was no sound, no cars, no dogs, no movement at all. The air felt too still, like the world had paused mid-breath. I stood there for a long minute just staring at those houses. My first instinct was to call out to see if anyone answered back, but something inside me told me not to. I decided to get back into the car and keep driving, figuring the main road had to connect somewhere up ahead. As I pulled out, I glanced again toward the houses, and that was when I realized the street stretched farther than I'd thought. There were more houses beyond the curve, and all of them looked the same. Lights burning, doors hanging open, and absolute silence. The further I went, the worse it got. Every mailbox was empty, no cars in the driveways, not even trash bins by the curb. I started feeling this odd pressure in my chest, like the air itself was heavier the deeper I went into that place. My phone still had no signal, but I could see the battery draining faster than usual. I rolled the window down halfway, hoping to hear some hint of life. Insects, wind, anything. But all I caught was the low hum of my engine echoing between the houses. Eventually, I slowed the car down near an intersection where the road split in 3 directions. On the corner stood a small white house with peeling paint and a swing set in the yard. The swing was moving slightly, not fast, just that slow, steady sway that doesn't stop even when the air is still. I stared at it long enough to notice that the chain made no sound. I thought maybe it was the wind playing tricks, but there was no breeze. I put the car in park again, against my better judgment, and stepped out just to see if someone might be inside. The closer I got to that house, the more wrong everything looked. The porch light flickered faintly, and inside, through the open door, I could see the television playing static. A cereal bowl sat on the counter, milk still in it, spoon resting on the edge. It was like someone had just walked away mid-breakfast. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone home?" And the sound of my own voice made me flinch. It came out too loud, too real, like it didn't belong there. No answer came, but the swing behind me had stopped moving. I stepped inside just far enough to see the living room. The carpet was clean but damp, like it had absorbed humidity for weeks. A clock on the wall ticked quietly, yet every second felt drawn out, delayed. I remember thinking that the air smelled faintly like metal, and that detail stuck with me more than anything else. I called out again, softer this time, but my voice didn't carry far. There were family photos on the wall. 2 kids, a man in work clothes, a woman with dark hair, but all of the frames faced slightly downward, as if someone had adjusted them that way on purpose. A noise came from deeper inside the house, something light, like a foot dragging over linoleum. I froze in the doorway and listened. It happened again, slower, almost deliberate. My first thought was that someone needed help, but then I noticed the hallway lights turning off one by one, from the far end toward me. Each bulb dimmed with a faint pop, until only the living room lamp remained. My pulse hammered in my ears. I took a slow step backward toward the porch, trying not to make a sound, and that was when I saw movement in the reflection of the television screen. It wasn't clear enough to make out a person, more like a shape standing halfway down the hall. It didn't move toward me. It just stood there, outlined by the last flicker of light before the living room lamp blinked out completely. I stumbled outside, nearly tripping over the porch steps, and ran to my car without daring to look back at the door. When I slammed the door shut, the automatic headlights illuminated the front of the house. The porch light had gone dark, but in every other house up the street, the lights were still burning bright. I drove off fast enough to send gravel flying. The road twisted for miles, but every few turns I'd glimpse another cluster of houses, each one with that same eerie pattern. Lights on, doors wide open, no one in sight. I kept expecting to see a police car, a roadblock, something that would explain it, but the road only stretched farther into black fields. When my gas light started blinking again, I nearly panicked, thinking I'd never find my way back. Then out of nowhere, I saw the glow of a highway sign ahead. The sign didn't name a place I recognized, but the sight of it was enough to make me pull over and breathe for a second. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel, and my throat felt raw. Behind me, the road stretched into total darkness. No headlights, no glow from those houses. I turned my car around to check just to see if they were still there, but the moment I faced that direction again, the road was empty. It was like that whole stretch of town had folded in on itself. When I reached the highway, traffic had returned. Trucks, headlights, the hum of normal life. I took the next exit with an open diner and stumbled inside, still in my scrubs, smelling like antiseptic and fear. The waitress gave me a worried look and asked if I was okay. I told her I'd taken a wrong turn near the gas station a few miles back, but she frowned and said there hadn't been a gas station out that way in years. She even called over a man sitting at the counter, some local driver, who confirmed it used to exist but burned down sometime in the early 2000s. I thought maybe I'd just mixed things up. Maybe the exhaustion had finally caught up to me. But when I walked back to my car after finishing my coffee, there was a layer of fine gray dust coating the hood, like ash. I touched it with my fingertips, and it smeared dark, greasy, like soot. My shoes left faint prints of it on the floor mat when I drove home. I cleaned the car the next day, but I swear the smell lingered, faint, metallic, like the air inside that empty house. I have never found that road again, no matter how many times I tried tracing my route. I even showed the area on the map to a coworker once, and she said it looked like farmland, nothing else. Still, sometimes when I drive home after night shifts, I catch a glimpse of porch lights glowing far off past the tree line. Small, steady dots in the dark. And every single time I make sure to stay on the highway. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Halloween night 2022 should have been just another fun night out in downtown Denver. At 31, I'd reached that age where costume parties felt more like an obligation than excitement. But my roommate Jenna had convinced me to join her and our friend Ashley for a bar crawl. We'd spent the afternoon putting together last-minute costumes. I went as a vampire with fake blood dripping down my chin. Jenna dressed as a zombie nurse with theatrical wounds painted on her arms. And Ashley transformed herself into a witch with this elaborate green face paint that took her 2 hours to perfect. The three of us had been friends since college, and even though we all had regular jobs now, I worked in marketing, Jenna taught elementary school, and Ashley managed a boutique downtown. We still made time for these nights out together. That particular evening started like any other Halloween celebration, with overpriced drinks, terrible music, and grown adults stumbling around in polyester costumes. The crawl took us through 5 different bars, each one more packed than the last, and by midnight we were exhausted and ready to head home. We'd been smart enough to leave our cars at home, planning to use a rideshare. But when we stumbled out of the final bar onto Larimer Street, the wait times were showing 45 minutes minimum. Ashley kept refreshing her app, cursing at the surge pricing that had hit 3 times the normal rate, while Jenna sat on the curb trying not to smudge her zombie makeup. That's when this guy in a firefighter costume approached us, one of those realistic ones with actual heavy gear, not the cheap Party City version. He had this friendly demeanor, pointing to a black SUV parked across the street and explaining that he was actually a rideshare driver who'd been picking up fares all night between stopping at parties. His app was supposedly glitching, he said, but he could take us for cash at the regular rate if we needed a ride. Everything about him seemed legitimate. He knew the exact base fare to our neighborhood, had one of those pine tree air fresheners hanging from his mirror, and even offered us bottles of water from a cooler in his back seat. The thing that really sold us was how professional he acted, checking our destination address on his phone's GPS, confirming our names even though we hadn't given them yet, which seemed weird for maybe half a second until Jenna laughed and said her name. Then we all followed suit. He helped Ashley into the front seat because she was wearing these massive platform boots that made walking treacherous, while Jenna and I climbed into the back. The interior was spotless, with leather seats and phone chargers in every door pocket. Exactly like every other rideshare I'd ever taken. He even had a playlist of popular music going, not too loud, and asked if we wanted to change the station. During the ride, he chatted casually about how busy Halloween was for drivers, mentioning specific street closures downtown that we'd noticed earlier, and complaining about drunk passengers who'd made a mess in his car the previous weekend. The water bottles he'd offered were sealed, store-bought. Nothing suspicious about them at all. I remember specifically checking because my mom had drilled stranger danger into my head since childhood. What happened next exists only in fragments, like trying to piece together a dream that keeps slipping away the more you chase it. I remember Ashley laughing at something on her phone, the glow lighting up her green painted face in the darkness of the car. I remember Jenna talking about some parent at her school who'd complained about the Halloween decorations being too scary for kindergarteners. I remember the driver adjusting his rearview mirror and asking if we needed to make any stops on the way home. Then there's just nothing. Not blackness, not sleep, but a complete absence of memory. Like those hours were surgically removed from my brain. The next thing I knew, I was waking up fully clothed on my couch at 4 p.m. on Sunday, still wearing my vampire costume with the fake blood now crusty and flaking onto my cushions. My phone was dead on the coffee table, my keys were somehow in the kitchen sink, and my shoes were placed neatly by the front door even though I never ever put them there. The first thing I did was charge my phone, desperate to piece together what had happened through texts or photos, but there was nothing after midnight except for 13 missed calls from Ashley's boyfriend, Connor. My call log showed I'd apparently called Jenna at 3:47 a.m., but I had zero recollection of this, and when I tried calling her back, it went straight to voicemail. The panic really started setting in when Connor answered on the first ring, his voice frantic, asking if Ashley was with me. She'd never come home, he said, hadn't answered any of his calls or texts, and her phone was going straight to voicemail just like Jenna's. He'd already called the hospitals, even driven to her parents' house in Aurora thinking maybe she'd gone there, but nobody had seen her since she left for the bar crawl with us. My head was pounding, not like a normal hangover, but this deep, disorienting fog that made thinking feel like swimming through syrup. I told Connor I'd just woken up, that I couldn't remember anything after getting in that car, and the silence on his end stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. Jenna showed up at my apartment 20 minutes later, still wearing her zombie nurse costume, mascara streaked down her face in black rivers. She had the same story, waking up in her own bed with no memory of getting there. Her apartment door unlocked even though she was obsessive about security. Her purse contents spread across her kitchen counter in a way she'd never do. Neither of us could remember anything after those first few minutes in the SUV, but both of us had woken up safely in our homes while Ashley was just gone. We spent the next 3 hours retracing our steps, calling every bar we'd visited, even walking down Larimer Street looking for that black SUV or anyone dressed as a firefighter who might have been driving for rideshares. The bars all remembered us. Hard to forget 3 women in elaborate costumes, but nobody had security footage of the street where we'd gotten picked up. One bouncer at the 3rd bar mentioned he'd seen us talking to someone in firefighter gear, said the guy had been hanging around all night but wasn't actually going into any of the bars, just lingering on the sidewalks where people were looking for rides. Connor had already filed a missing person report by Sunday evening, and 2 detectives came to my apartment Monday morning to take our statements. Detective Garrison, an older woman with gray streaks in her hair, kept asking about the water bottles. Did we drink them? Did we see him drink one? Did we keep any of them? Of course we hadn't kept them, and neither Jenna nor I could even remember if we'd actually drunk the water or just held the bottles. The younger detective, Reeves, was more interested in the driver himself, pulling up photos on his tablet of registered rideshare drivers to see if we recognized anyone. None of them looked familiar, but then again, between the darkness and our intoxicated state, I could barely picture his face beyond a vague impression of stubble and what might have been brown eyes. They asked about the make and model of the SUV, but all I could tell them was that it was black, maybe a Chevy or GMC, definitely newer because it had that backup camera screen in the dashboard. Jenna remembered even less, just that the seats were tan or beige leather, and that there'd been an energy drink can in one of the cup holders. The breakthrough came Wednesday afternoon when Detective Garrison called to say they'd found security footage from an ATM camera 2 blocks from where we'd gotten picked up. The timestamp showed 12:23 a.m., our car pulling away from the curb with all 3 of us visible through the windows. The license plate was partially obscured by mud or something deliberately smeared on it, but they could make out that it was a Colorado plate starting with F. More importantly, they'd tracked the vehicle through various traffic cameras heading east through downtown. But then it just vanished after turning into an industrial area near the railroad tracks. No cameras covered that specific zone, and the SUV never emerged onto any of the main roads that had surveillance. They dispatched units to search the area, checking abandoned warehouses and empty lots, but it was like the vehicle had simply evaporated. Garrison mentioned something that made my chest tighten. The ATM footage showed the driver getting out briefly to help Ashley into the front seat, and he was wearing thick work gloves despite it being a warm October night. Friday morning changed everything in the worst possible way. A jogger found Ashley's phone in a drainage ditch about 8 miles outside the city limits, near an old access road that nobody used anymore except for illegal dumping. The phone was still recording. It had been recording audio since 12:31 a.m. Sunday morning, roughly 8 minutes after we'd gotten into that SUV. 67 hours of continuous audio until the battery finally died. The police wouldn't tell us everything that was on the recording, but Detective Garrison's face when she mentioned it told me more than her words ever could. She went pale when she explained that the first hour contained mostly muffled voices and car sounds, then long periods of silence broken by occasional noises they were still analyzing. What they did share was that around the 40-minute mark, you could hear Ashley's voice very clearly saying she felt sick, then asking why we weren't responding to her. After that, her voice didn't appear on the recording again, just ambient sound and what might have been footsteps on gravel much later. The audio revealed something else that made everything infinitely worse. At 1:15 a.m., you could clearly hear a garage door opening and closing. Then there were distinct sounds of movement, like furniture being shifted or heavy objects being dragged across concrete. At 2:47 a.m., there was the sound of a different vehicle starting, probably a truck based on the engine noise. The recording captured this second vehicle driving for approximately 22 minutes before stopping. Then came the worst part, the sound of a shovel hitting dirt, rhythmic and methodical for nearly an hour. The police had tech specialists enhancing the audio, trying to pick up any identifying sounds or voices during those crucial hours. They'd also used the phone's GPS data to track its movement, but whoever had it had disabled location services after the first hour, and the phone had stayed in that ditch from approximately 4 a.m. Sunday until it was found Friday. Garrison asked if we remembered anyone mentioning construction sites or property outside the city, but our minds were just blank walls where those hours should have been. Saturday brought the most terrifying revelation yet, when the tech team managed to enhance a portion of the audio from around 3:30 a.m. They isolated what sounded like a muffled conversation between two men, our firefighter and someone else. The second voice was asking about the other two, and whether they'd remember anything. The response was too garbled to make out completely, but the specialists detected the word dose and something that sounded like their apartments. That's when I realized with absolute clarity that this man had been in my home, had physically carried me inside, arranged my belongings, and left me on my couch like some kind of twisted dollhouse figure. Jenna broke down completely when we heard this, realizing he'd done the same to her, had probably stood in our bedrooms watching us unconscious, deciding what to do with us. The police immediately processed our apartments for DNA and fingerprints, but whoever this was had been meticulous. Not a single print besides ours. No DNA evidence, no fibers or hair that didn't belong to us or our regular visitors. Even the water bottles from the car were gone, likely disposed of along with any other evidence from the vehicle. The investigation intensified with the FBI getting involved due to the suspected kidnapping across state lines, based on some background noise in the audio that suggested movement into Wyoming or Nebraska. They brought in cadaver dogs to search the industrial area where the SUV had vanished, and while the dogs alerted to several spots, no body was found. Yet. Meanwhile, Connor was barely functioning, staying at his parents' house because he couldn't stand being in the apartment he'd shared with Ashley. The worst part was how calculated everything had been. This person had studied rideshare apps, knew exactly what price to quote, understood which areas had surveillance gaps, and had somehow managed to dose 3 people so precisely that 2 of us survived while 1 disappeared. He'd even known our names before we gave them, which meant he'd been watching us throughout the night, possibly heard us introduce ourselves at one of the bars, or seen our IDs when we were getting them checked. The firefighter costume wasn't random either. People inherently trust first responders, let their guard down around someone who seems like a hero. Every single detail had been orchestrated, from the legitimate-looking car setup to knowing exactly how to make Jenna and me appear like we'd just had too much to drink, ensuring nobody would immediately suspect foul play when we couldn't remember our night. The break in the case came 2 weeks later through pure luck. A construction worker renovating an old fire station 40 miles away found a firefighter costume stuffed behind a loose wall panel, along with a set of car keys and a roll of cash. The keys belonged to a black Suburban registered to a man named Gregory Hoffman, who'd been reported missing by his family 3 days before Halloween. His SUV was found a week after that, completely stripped and burned in a field near the Kansas border. But forensics still managed to pull DNA from blood traces in the trunk that matched Ashley. Gregory Hoffman's body turned up in his own basement. He'd been dead since October 28th, killed in his own home while his family thought he was away on a hunting trip. The real killer had taken his vehicle, his identity, and used both to hunt on Halloween night. Security footage from a gas station near Gregory's house showed a man filling up the Suburban on October 30th, wearing a baseball cap and keeping his face turned away from cameras, but his build matched what little we could remember. The same man appeared on traffic cameras driving toward downtown Denver on Halloween night, already wearing the firefighter costume. They never found Ashley's body, though they searched for months using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and volunteer search teams. They never caught the man who took her either. The DNA found at Gregory's house didn't match anyone in the system, and the fingerprints they lifted from Gregory's basement door were from someone who'd never been arrested or worked in any job requiring prints. Jenna moved back to Ohio to live with her family, unable to handle staying in Denver. Connor left the state entirely. Last I heard, he was somewhere in Florida trying to start over. As for me, I still live in the same apartment, though I installed 3 deadbolts and a security system that would rival a bank's. I still can't remember those missing hours, even after trying hypnotherapy and various other treatments to recover the memories. Sometimes I wonder if not remembering is actually a mercy, if my brain is protecting me from something too horrible to process. The police keep the case open, calling occasionally when they have a lead that never pans out. They did tell me one last detail from the audio. In the final hours of recording, just before the phone died, you could hear a distant train horn and what sounded like someone whistling a children's song, though they could never identify which one. Ashley's parents still call me sometimes, not blaming me, but desperately hoping I'll remember something, anything, that might help them find their daughter. All I can tell them is what I know, that she got in that car with us, and then she was gone, and 2 of us were lucky enough to wake up. Halloween night, 2018. At 16, my biggest worry was whether Brad from chemistry class noticed my new haircut. My parents owned a small bookstore downtown, and we lived in this old Victorian house at the edge of Riverside, California, where the neighborhood meets the woods. That night, my younger brother Nathan was at a sleepover, and my parents had gone to bed around 11 after handing out candy to the last trick-or-treaters. I stayed up in my room, scrolling through Instagram and texting my best friend Kayla about the party we'd missed, because my dad said it would run too late. The house was finally quiet, just the occasional creak of old wood settling, and the wind rustling through the massive oak tree outside my window. Around 12:30, I heard it. This soft, rhythmic knocking coming from downstairs. Not loud or aggressive, just persistent. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. At first, I thought maybe some drunk teenagers were messing around, trying to get one last scare in before Halloween officially ended. We'd had problems before with kids from the high school throwing eggs at houses or leaving creepy dolls on porches as pranks. I crept out of my room, avoiding the squeaky floorboard near my door, and made my way down the hallway. The knocking continued, steady and patient, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. From the landing, I could see our front door through the stairway railings, and the porch light was on, casting long shadows through the frosted glass panels. I tiptoed down to the living room and moved toward the window beside the door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The blinds were closed, but I could angle them just enough to see outside without being noticed. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. There was a woman sitting on our porch steps, facing away from the door. She was barefoot, which seemed strange for late October, and her shoulders were shaking like she was crying or maybe just cold. Her hair was long and tangled, hanging down her back in dark, matted strands. She wore what looked like a light blue dress or nightgown, but even from behind, I could see dark stains spreading across the fabric. The way she sat there, hunched over and rocking slightly, made her look broken somehow. She wasn't knocking anymore, she was just sitting there trembling in the yellow porch light. I must have made some noise because she started to turn her head, and I quickly stepped back from the window. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Part of me wanted to wake up my parents, but another part kept thinking maybe she needed help. Maybe she'd been in an accident or someone had hurt her. I peered through the blinds again, this time getting a partial view of her profile. Her face was pale, almost gray under the porch light, and there were dark streaks running down her cheeks, whether from makeup, dirt, or something else I couldn't tell. She kept looking over her shoulder toward the street, quick, nervous glances like she expected someone to appear at any moment. Then she started knocking again, harder this time, and I heard her voice, hoarse and desperate, calling out something I couldn't quite make out through the door. The knocking got loud enough that I heard my parents' bedroom door open upstairs. My dad came down in his pajamas and bathrobe, squinting in the hallway light. "What's going on?" he asked, seeing me pressed against the wall near the window. I pointed toward the door and whispered about the woman outside. He frowned and moved to look through the peephole. I watched his expression change from annoyed to concerned in seconds. He turned to me and said quietly, "Go get your mother. Tell her to bring her phone." While I ran upstairs, I heard him unlocking the deadbolt. My mom was already awake, sitting up in bed, and when I told her about the woman, she grabbed her phone and followed me back down. We found my dad standing in the doorway, the chain still on, talking to someone outside. Through the gap in the door, I could hear the woman's voice clearly now, raw and frantic. Please, you have to help me. He's coming for me. I got away, but he's coming. Please let me in, please." Her words tumbled out in a rush, some of them slurred like she might be drunk or in shock. My dad was trying to calm her down, asking her what happened, who was after her, if she needed an ambulance. But she kept repeating the same things, that someone was coming, that she'd barely gotten away, that we needed to call the police right now. My mom was already dialing 911, giving our address in that controlled voice she used during emergencies. The woman outside started crying harder, these horrible, choking sobs that made my chest tight. Then suddenly she went quiet and whispered, "Oh God, I hear his car. He found me. He found me again." My dad immediately shut and locked the door, telling us to get away from the windows. The woman outside started pounding on the door, screaming now, begging us not to leave her out there. It was awful, the sound of pure terror in her voice. My mom was still on the phone with the dispatcher, explaining the situation, saying we needed officers immediately. Through all the chaos, I didn't hear any car engine, didn't see any headlights through the curtains, but the woman was hysterical, scrambling around our porch, her bare feet slapping against the wooden boards. We could hear her trying our windows, pulling at them desperately. My dad grabbed a baseball bat from the hall closet and positioned himself between us and the front door. For maybe 30 seconds, everything went silent except for my mom's voice giving details to the police. Then we heard the woman shriek, not a scream of fear, but something primal and furious. And the sound of her running, those bare feet slapping down our porch steps and onto the gravel driveway. I rushed to the side window despite my dad yelling at me to stay back. In the moonlight, I saw her running toward the tree line behind our house, her pale dress or nightgown flowing behind her like a ghost. She moved fast for someone who'd seemed so injured and desperate, disappearing into the woods within seconds. The police arrived about 8 minutes later, 2 patrol cars with their lights flashing, officers with flashlights checking our porch and yard. They found blood on our steps, just drops and smears, and bare footprints in the dirt leading toward the woods. My parents explained everything while I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket my mom had brought me, trying to process what had just happened. The officers took our statements, then 2 of them went into the woods with their flashlights while the others stayed to search the area around our house. We waited in the living room for what felt like forever, drinking the coffee my mom had made to keep us alert. The officers who'd gone into the woods came back after about 40 minutes, shaking their heads. They'd followed the footprints for maybe a quarter mile before losing them near the creek that runs through the forest. No sign of the woman anywhere. They called for backup and a K9 unit, expanding the search area. One officer stayed at our house in case she came back while the others coordinated the search. My dad kept pacing, checking the locks on all the doors and windows. None of us could understand how someone so desperate for help would suddenly run away like that, especially barefoot into the woods at night. The officer mentioned that sometimes domestic violence victims act erratically, torn between seeking help and protecting their abusers. But something about the whole situation felt wrong to me. The way she'd said someone was coming when there was no car. The way she'd switched from terrified to furious in seconds. Around 4 in the morning, we got the news. A detective came to our door, his face serious and tired. They'd found a car crashed into a ravine about 3 miles from our house, on the old service road that runs parallel to the woods. A silver sedan, completely smashed up like it had gone off the road at high speed. Inside were 2 bodies, a man in his 30s in the driver's seat, and a woman in the passenger seat. Both had been dead for hours, the detective said, probably since before midnight. The woman matched the general description of who we'd seen. Similar hair color, similar age range. But here's what made everyone go silent. Both bodies were still wearing their seatbelts, and there was no evidence anyone else had been in the car. The blood pattern showed they'd both died on impact. There was no way either of them could have walked away from that crash, let alone run to our house and pound on our door. The detective asked us more questions, had us describe every detail about the woman we'd seen. They brought a forensic team to collect the blood samples from our porch and photograph the footprints. My mom showed them the recording from our doorbell camera. We'd forgotten about it in all the chaos. The footage was grainy in the darkness, but you could see her clearly enough. A woman in a pale blue dress sitting on our steps, then standing and pounding on the door, then running toward the woods. The timestamp showed 12:47 a.m. But according to the coroner's initial assessment, the accident had happened around 11 p.m., maybe earlier. The detective kept asking if we were sure we'd only seen one woman, if maybe someone else had been hiding nearby. But we all saw the same person, heard the same voice. They continued searching for days, even brought in dogs specially trained to track injured people. Nothing. No other footprints, no torn fabric caught on branches, no blood trail in the woods beyond our property. The official investigation went on for weeks. They identified the victims, a couple from 2 towns over who'd been driving back from a Halloween party. The man had a blood alcohol level over the legal limit. The theory was he'd taken the back road to avoid the main highway and lost control on a curve. But they never found any explanation for what we experienced that night. No escaped mental patient, no missing person who matched the woman we'd seen, no identical twin sister. The blood on our porch matched the female victim from the crash, but the forensics team couldn't explain how it got there. Eventually, the case was closed as an accident with unexplained circumstances. We moved out 6 months later, not because we were scared exactly, but because none of us could walk past those porch steps without remembering her voice, her desperate knocking, the way she'd run into the darkness. I still dream about it sometimes. Wake up thinking I hear someone at the door begging to be let in. The thing about college parties is that they all blend together after a while. But that night in October at the house on Birch Avenue is burned into my memory like a scar that won't fade. I was halfway through my junior year at State University, grinding through economics courses and surviving on ramen and energy drinks like every other broke college student. My roommate Jake Sullivan and I had been inseparable since freshman orientation, one of those friendships that just clicked from day one. Jake had this incredible ability to make friends with literally anyone. He'd walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 5 new contacts and plans for the weekend. He was the guy who'd lend you his last $20 knowing you'd probably forget to pay him back, who'd drive across town at 3 in the morning to pick you up when your ride bailed, who knew exactly when you needed to hear a terrible joke to break the tension during finals week. We'd been through everything together those first 2 years. Failed exams, successful parties, that disastrous spring break road trip where his car broke down in the middle of nowhere. That particular Saturday night, we were headed to what everyone was calling the party of the semester, hosted by some seniors renting this ancient house that looked like it hadn't seen repairs since the 70s. Jake and I showed up around 10 wearing matching zombie costumes. Basically just thrift store clothes we'd destroyed with scissors and covered in fake blood that kept staining everything we touched. The house was absolutely insane when we walked in. Easily 200 people crammed wall to wall. The air so thick with artificial fog and body heat that breathing felt like work. The seniors had gone all out transforming the place. Seizure-inducing strobe lights in what used to be the living room. Kitchen converted into a chaotic bar where people were mixing drinks with whatever they could find. Fake cobwebs and plastic skeletons hanging from every doorway and light fixture. But the basement was the main attraction. They'd turned it into this underground club with ultraviolet lights everywhere. The concrete walls covered in neon paint that glowed like toxic waste in the darkness. Getting down there required fighting through a mass of sweaty bodies on stairs so narrow you had to turn sideways. Everyone holding drinks above their heads to avoid spilling, the temperature rising with each step down. Once you made it to the bottom, the heat hit you like walking into a sauna. The bass from the speakers so intense it felt like your bones were vibrating. Everyone packed so tight you moved as one giant organism in the darkness. Around midnight, Jake and I were down in that basement, pressed against the back wall trying to catch our breath between songs. The face paint we'd applied so carefully earlier was now running down our faces in gray streaks, making us look more like melting wax figures than zombies. Jake had been dancing with this girl dressed as a vampire for the past hour, but she disappeared upstairs with her friends, leaving him doing these exaggerated dance moves to make me laugh. The crowd around us was getting wilder by the minute. People climbing on each other's shoulders, drinks flying everywhere. Someone had started spraying glow-in-the-dark silly string from a can they'd brought. Jake leaned over and shouted something in my ear about needing air, that the heat was making him dizzy, and started pushing his way toward what he thought was an exit door in the corner. I nodded and turned back to the crowd, figuring he'd be back in 5 minutes like always. There were so many people crushed together that when someone pushed from behind, we all moved forward like dominoes, and by the time I looked back to where Jake had been heading, he'd already vanished into the mass of bodies. 20 minutes passed, then 30, and Jake still hadn't come back. At first I wasn't worried, figured he'd probably run into someone upstairs, maybe got caught up in a conversation or found his way to the bathroom line that stretched halfway down the hall. I pushed my way up the basement stairs, the temperature dropping with each step, my shirt soaked through with sweat going cold against my skin. The main floor was just as packed but definitely cooler. People sprawled on couches, couples making out in corners. Someone had started a beer pong tournament in what used to be the dining room. I checked the kitchen, the back porch where smokers had congregated, even waited outside the bathroom for 10 minutes thinking he might be sick in there. Asked a few people if they'd seen a tall guy in a zombie costume, but that description fit about 30 different people at the party. The weird thing was that Jake's phone kept going straight to voicemail, not ringing, just immediate voicemail like it was turned off or dead. That wasn't like him at all. Jake was the type who'd answer texts while showering, who kept a portable charger in his pocket because he never let his phone die. By 1 in the morning, I was starting to panic. I'd searched every room in the house twice, even pushed my way back down to the basement thinking maybe I'd missed him in the crowd. The party was still raging, but I couldn't focus on anything except finding Jake. I grabbed this guy Steve who lived down the hall from us in the dorms, explained that my roommate had disappeared, and he helped me search again. We went through the whole house systematically this time. Every bedroom, closet, even checked the backyard where people had built a bonfire in a metal trash can. Steve suggested maybe Jake had hooked up with someone and left, but that didn't make sense either. Jake would have texted me, would have sent one of his stupid emoji combinations that only he thought were funny, would have let me know he was heading out. Plus, his car was still parked exactly where we'd left it 3 blocks away. I'd run out to check, hoping maybe he'd felt sick and gone to sleep it off. The windows were fogged up from the cold, but I could see through enough to know he wasn't inside, and his spare key was still hidden in the magnetic box under the wheel well, where he always kept it. I finally found the host, this senior named Kevin Brennan, who I'd only met once before, and asked him if there were any other exits from the basement. anywhere Jake might have gone to get some air. Kevin looked at me like I was insane, his pupils dilated and clearly several drinks deep into the night. He said the basement only had one entrance, those narrow stairs everyone was using, and that the door in the corner had been locked and blocked off for months. When I insisted Jake had headed toward that corner door, Kevin got defensive, said that area was off limits, that they'd specifically piled boxes and old furniture in front of it to keep drunk people from messing around back there. But Jake had definitely walked in that direction. I could picture it clearly, him weaving through the crowd, his hand up in that half wave he always did, heading straight for that corner. Kevin started getting aggressive, asking why I was trying to cause problems, saying maybe my friend just left without telling me, that I needed to chill out and stop making accusations. The music was still pounding from the basement, but suddenly it felt threatening instead of exciting, like the rhythm of something terrible happening just out of sight. Steve and I went back down to the basement one more time, using our phone flashlights to cut through the UV lighting and actually see that corner clearly. The crowd had thinned out just a little, enough that we could push through to the back wall without too much resistance. There were definitely boxes stacked up in that corner, old cardboard things with water damage and torn edges, plus what looked like a broken couch standing on its end. But when I looked closer, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. There were fresh scrape marks on the concrete floor, like something heavy had been dragged recently. The dust patterns didn't match either. You could see clean rectangular shapes where boxes had been sitting for a long time, but they weren't lined up with where the boxes were now. Someone had moved all this stuff recently, maybe even tonight. Steve saw it too, started pulling at one of the boxes to see what was behind them. But then Kevin appeared with two other guys, all of them bigger than us, telling us we needed to leave immediately. They weren't asking. They physically grabbed our arms and started marching us toward the stairs. Kevin saying something about calling the cops if we didn't get out of his house right now, that we were killing the vibe and freaking people out. They literally threw us out the front door, Steve stumbling and almost falling down the porch steps. I tried to explain one more time that my best friend was missing, that something was seriously wrong, but Kevin just stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. His face completely changed from the friendly party host to something cold and dangerous. He said Jake had probably just found a girl and bailed, that it happened all the time at parties, and if I came back or tried to cause more trouble, he'd make sure campus security heard about it. The door slammed in our faces, the deadbolt clicking into place, and suddenly we were standing on the sidewalk in the cold October air, while the party continued inside without us. Steve wanted to leave, kept saying we should just wait until tomorrow when everyone sobered up, but I couldn't shake the image of those scrape marks on the floor. I called Jake's phone probably 50 times, sent text after text, even tried calling his mom back home but hung up before it connected because what would I even say? That he vanished at a party and the host was acting suspicious? The police would laugh at me, probably assume he was just drunk somewhere or had hooked up like everyone kept suggesting. I stayed outside that house until 4 in the morning, sitting in my car parked across the street, watching people slowly trickle out as the party died down. Every time someone emerged from the front door, my heart would race thinking it might be Jake, but it never was. Around 3:30, I saw Kevin and his roommates carrying garbage bags out to the curb, moving quickly and quietly like they didn't want to draw attention. One of the bags tore open when they tossed it, and I could see what looked like clothing spilling out, but they quickly gathered everything up and stuffed it into another bag before I could get a better look. The basement lights stayed on long after the rest of the house went dark, and I could see shadows moving past the small ground-level windows, but the glass was too grimy and painted over to make out what was happening inside. My phone battery died around dawn, and I finally drove back to campus, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe Jake had felt sick and someone had taken him to the hospital. Maybe he'd had some kind of allergic reaction to something. Maybe there was a back exit I didn't know about, and he'd left without his car for some reason. Sunday morning, I filed a missing person report with campus police, even though they clearly didn't take it seriously at first. The officer kept asking if Jake had been drinking, if we'd had an argument, if he had a history of taking off without telling anyone. I gave them Kevin's name and address, explained everything about the basement and the blocked door, the suspicious behavior, how Jake's car was still there. It wasn't until I mentioned that Jake was supposed to take a midterm on Monday, that he had perfect attendance and would never miss an exam, that they finally agreed to do a welfare check at the house. I went with them, sitting in the back of the patrol car as we drove to Birch Avenue, my stomach churning with a mixture of hope and dread. The house looked different in daylight, shabbier, smaller, with Halloween decorations hanging limp and sad from the porch railings. Kevin answered the door looking haggard and annoyed, but his expression changed quickly when he saw the uniforms. He was suddenly cooperative, concerned even, saying he'd help however he could, that he hoped Jake was okay, that these parties sometimes got out of hand and people wandered off. The police searched the main floors first while Kevin followed them around, explaining that hundreds of people had been through the house, that it would be impossible to know where everyone went. When they got to the basement, I watched Kevin's jaw tighten as they approached that corner with the stacked boxes. He quickly mentioned that area was just storage, that it had been blocked off for months because of water damage, that no one could have gone back there during the party. But one of the officers, an older woman with sharp eyes, noticed the same scrape marks I'd seen and asked Kevin to move the boxes. He protested at first, said it was dangerous back there, that the landlord had specifically told them not to let anyone pass that point, but the officers insisted. It took them about 10 minutes to clear everything away, Kevin getting more agitated with each box they moved. His roommates now gathered at the top of the stairs watching nervously. Behind all that junk was a door, just like I'd suspected, but it was different than I expected. Heavy wood reinforced with metal brackets with a padlock that looked brand new hanging from the latch. Kevin immediately said he didn't have the key, that the landlord must have locked it, that it probably just led to old heating equipment or something. The officers made him call the landlord right there, and while they waited, I noticed one of Kevin's roommates slip away upstairs, pulling out his phone as he went. The landlord arrived within 20 minutes, a nervous older man named George Hoffman who kept wiping his palms on his jeans. He fumbled with a ring of keys for what felt like forever, before finding the right one, his hands trembling as he worked the padlock. The door opened to reveal wooden stairs descending into darkness, way deeper than the basement level, with a smell coming up that made everyone step back, musty and metallic and wrong. The cops went down first with flashlights while we waited above, Kevin now completely silent, his face gray. I could hear them moving around down there, their voices echoing strangely, and then one of them shouted for everyone to get back, to not come any closer. The older officer came up the stairs fast, already on her radio calling for backup and crime scene techs, her face pale. She wouldn't tell me what they'd found, just kept saying to wait outside, that this was now an active investigation. But I heard her tell the dispatcher they'd discovered what appeared to be an old storm shelter that had been recently accessed, with evidence of blood and a single brown leather sneaker that matched the description of what Jake had been wearing. Within an hour, the entire street was blocked off with police tape, detectives, and forensic teams swarming the house. They arrested Kevin and his 3 roommates on the spot, putting them in separate patrol cars while they processed the scene. I sat on the curb across the street for hours, watching them carry evidence bags out of that house, each one making my hope drain a little more. Finally, a detective named Melissa Chen came over and sat beside me, her voice gentle as she explained what they'd pieced together so far. The storm shelter had been built in the 50s during the Cold War, a concrete bunker that previous tenants had used for storage until it was supposedly sealed off 5 years ago. But Kevin and his roommates had discovered it when they moved in, had been using it for something the detective wouldn't specify, something that required them to soundproof it and install a new ventilation system. They found evidence that someone had been held down there recently, signs of a struggle, blood on the concrete walls. Jake's shoe was there, along with his wallet and phone, which had been smashed to pieces. The detective said they were still searching, that there were other passages connected to the shelter that led to the city's old maintenance tunnels, that Jake might have escaped that way or been moved. The truth came out 3 days later when one of Kevin's roommates, a guy named Paul Morrison, broke down and told the police everything in exchange for a plea deal. They'd been using the storm shelter to run some kind of underground fighting ring, bringing drunk college kids down there to fight for money, while others bet on the outcomes. Jake had apparently stumbled onto their operation when he went looking for that exit door, had seen something he shouldn't have through a gap in the boxes. They'd panicked and grabbed him, dragged him down to the shelter to figure out what to do, but Jake had fought back harder than they expected. During the struggle, he'd managed to break free and run deeper into the tunnels, and they'd lost him in the maze of old maintenance passages. Search teams spent 2 weeks combing through those tunnels with dogs and thermal cameras, and finally found Jake about a mile from the house, alive but barely. He'd been wandering in complete darkness for 3 days, had fallen down a maintenance shaft and broken his leg, survived by drinking condensation off the pipes. He'd lost a frightening amount of weight and couldn't stop shaking for weeks afterward, but he was alive, and that's all that mattered to me. Kevin got 15 years for kidnapping and running an illegal gambling operation. His roommates got lesser sentences for their cooperation. The university shut down all parties at off-campus houses for the rest of the year, and that old house on Birch Avenue was condemned and demolished by spring. Jake spent a month in physical therapy learning to walk properly again, and another 3 months in counseling dealing with the trauma of being trapped underground in complete darkness. He never talks about what he saw in that shelter before he ran, just gets this distant look and changes the subject. We're still roommates, still best friends, but something shifted that night. We both learned how quickly a normal college party could turn into a nightmare, how the people serving you drinks might be hiding something monstrous right beneath your feet. Jake graduated last May and got a job at an accounting firm downtown, and I'm finishing up my senior year now. But neither of us goes to house parties anymore, and Jake still sleeps with a nightlight on, still checks every door in a room to make sure he knows where the exits are. Sometimes I catch him staring at nothing, rubbing that scar on his leg from where the bone broke through, and I know he's back in those tunnels, running through the darkness, trying to find his way out. Frank Dawson's Halloween displays were legendary on Cedar Ridge Drive, the kind of thing real estate agents would actually mention when showing houses in the area. Every October, he'd transform his entire front yard into something that belonged in a horror movie studio lot, not a quiet residential street in Portland. The man had mannequins so realistic that delivery drivers would refuse to walk past them after dark, preferring to leave packages at the edge of his property. His fake blood mixture had this glossy, thick consistency that never seemed to fully dry, and he'd splatter it across his driveway in patterns that looked like someone had dragged a body toward his garage. There were motion-activated screams, strobe lights hidden in the bushes, and this fog machine that would billow out thick clouds whenever someone walked by, making the whole scene look like a crime photographer's nightmare. The neighborhood had gotten used to it over the years, treating Frank's obsession like a quirky local tradition. Parents would walk their kids by during daylight hours for a safe scare. Teenagers would dare each other to touch the corpse dummy he always positioned reaching out from under his porch. And even the police had stopped responding to concerned calls from visitors who didn't know about Frank's hobby. He worked construction during the day but spent every free moment in October perfecting his setup, adding new pieces each year that he'd been crafting in his garage since January. Last year, he'd added this incredibly disturbing piece, a mannequin dressed as a jogger, sprawled across his lawn with running shoes still on, earbuds trailing from its ears, positioned like someone had attacked them mid-run. The attention to detail was unsettling. He'd even added sweat stains to the shirt and grass stains on the knees. This year, Frank started earlier than usual, hauling stuff out on October 1st instead of waiting until the second week like he normally did. I watched from my living room window as he arranged what looked like a whole crime scene across his yard. Yellow tape sectioning off areas, evidence markers next to pools of that signature fake blood, and bodies positioned at weird angles all over the grass. But something about this year's main centerpiece made me stop mid-sip of my morning coffee. Right in the middle of his lawn, illuminated by a spotlight he'd installed, was a man in a business suit, face down with one arm stretched toward the sidewalk like he'd been trying to crawl away. The suit was navy blue with subtle pinstripes, the kind you'd see at any downtown office, and there was a briefcase spilled open near the body with papers scattered around it. Frank had even added a coffee cup on its side, dark liquid staining the papers brown. The thing that really got me was how fresh everything looked. Usually, Frank's props had this theatrical quality, obviously fake even when they were well made. But this businessman dummy looked different. The suit fabric had natural wrinkles where the body was positioned. The leather shoes had scuff marks on the soles, and when the wind picked up, I swear I saw the jacket flutter in a way that seemed too natural for a stuffed mannequin. Frank spent hours adjusting the scene, moving the briefcase a few inches here, repositioning the papers there, stepping back to examine his work like an artist with a canvas. When he finally went inside that evening, I found myself staring at that suited figure for longer than I should have, trying to figure out what exactly made it so much more convincing than his previous displays. By day 3, the smell started. At first I thought maybe Frank had gone overboard with some kind of rotting food effect, trying to add another sensory element to his display. The October heat wave we were having, temperatures pushing into the mid-70s when they should have been in the 50s, wasn't helping. That sweet heavy odor would drift across my yard whenever the wind shifted, making me close my windows despite the warm weather. I saw other neighbors doing the same thing, Mrs. Kalinsky from 2 houses down actually came over to ask if I knew what Frank was using this year. That stank so bad. Her beagle wouldn't even walk past Frank's house anymore, pulling against his leash and whining whenever she tried to take him that direction. The mailman started leaving Frank's mail at the end of his driveway, instead of walking up to the door slot. Frank didn't seem to notice or care about the smell. Every evening he'd come out with a beer, sit on his porch steps, and admire his handiwork like nothing was wrong. He'd wave at anyone who passed by, that proud grin on his face, completely oblivious to how people were starting to speed walk past his property with their shirts pulled up over their noses. On October 4th, I finally went over to talk to him about it, catching him as he was adjusting some of the scattered papers around the businessman dummy. The smell hit me like a physical wall when I got within 10 feet of the display. It was that thick, cloying stench that made my eyes water and my stomach turn. Nothing like the artificial Halloween scents they sold at party stores. Frank just laughed when I mentioned it, said he'd found some new decomposition spray online that was supposed to be super realistic, military-grade stuff that crime scene cleanup crews used for training. Standing that close to the businessman prop, I noticed other details that made my skin prickle. There was a wedding ring on the left hand, one of those tungsten bands that were popular a few years back, and a watch that was still ticking. I could see the second hand moving through the crystal face. The hair looked real too, not that synthetic Halloween store stuff, but actual human hair with gray streaks at the temples, individual strands moving in the breeze. When I mentioned how incredibly realistic it looked, Frank got this weird expression, almost confused, and said he hadn't added any new props this year, just rearranged his old ones better. That didn't make sense because I'd never seen this particular dummy before, and I'd been watching Frank set up his displays for 5 years straight. He brushed off my questions and went back to arranging his scene, but I noticed he kept glancing at the businessman prop with this puzzled look, like he was trying to remember where it came from. That night I couldn't sleep, partly from the smell that was somehow getting stronger, and partly from a nagging feeling in my gut. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and looked out my bedroom window at Frank's yard. The streetlight cast long shadows across his display, and I could see the businessman prop clearly from my second-floor view. Maybe it was my tired eyes playing tricks, but I swear the position looked different from earlier. The outstretched arm seemed to have moved a few inches closer to the sidewalk. I grabbed my phone and took a picture, telling myself I was being paranoid but wanting some kind of proof. The next morning, I compared the photo to what I was seeing, and sure enough, the arm had definitely shifted. When I saw Frank that afternoon getting his mail, I asked if he'd been adjusting the display during the night. He looked at me like I was crazy and said he hadn't touched anything since yesterday evening. Why would he be messing with it at 2 in the morning? October 5th was when things really went sideways. I was grading papers at my kitchen table when I heard this commotion outside. Dogs barking like crazy, car doors slamming, voices shouting. Through my window, I saw Mrs. Kalinsky's beagle had gotten loose and run straight into Frank's yard, going right for the businessman display. The dog was pawing at the figure, whimpering and barking, trying to grab something with its teeth. Mrs. Kalinsky was screaming for her dog to come back, but she wouldn't step foot on Frank's property. Frank came running out of his house yelling at the dog to get away from his display, but when he got close enough to grab the beagle's collar, he suddenly stopped dead. The color drained from his face as he stared down at what the dog had been pawing at, a wallet that had fallen out of the businessman's pocket. Frank picked it up with trembling fingers, opened it, and I could see him mouth the words, "Oh God," over and over as he looked at whatever ID was inside. The police arrived within 20 minutes of Frank's call. Not just one patrol car, but 3, then a van, then people in different uniforms who started putting up actual crime scene tape that looked exactly like Frank's fake ones. They cleared everyone back, wouldn't let anyone get close, but from my porch I could hear fragments of their radio chatter. "Missing person," they kept saying. Robert Henley, local insurance adjuster, hadn't come home from work 6 days ago. His wife had reported him missing on October 2nd, said he'd left the office like normal, but never made it home. The way the cops were looking at Frank, taking pictures of his entire display, measuring distances between props, it was clear they thought he'd done something. Frank kept shaking his head, explaining over and over that he'd found all his mannequins already positioned when he started setting up on October 1st, assumed someone had played an early Halloween prank by adding extra props to his collection in the night. He swore he thought it was just another dummy, maybe one that someone didn't want anymore and figured he'd appreciate. The coroner confirmed what the smell had been telling us all along. Robert Henley had been dead for approximately 6 days, likely killed elsewhere and deliberately placed in Frank's yard sometime during the night of September 30th. The real kicker came when detectives found security footage from the house 3 doors down that had a partial view of Frank's yard. The grainy video showed a van pulling up around 3 in the morning on October 1st, someone in dark clothes dragging something heavy across Frank's lawn, spending about 15 minutes arranging it among the Halloween decorations that Frank had left out from the previous year. The person knew exactly what they were doing, positioning the body to blend in perfectly with Frank's signature style. They'd even scattered fake evidence markers around to make it look like part of the scene. The detective told me later that whoever did it had probably been watching Frank's displays for years, knew his patterns, knew he'd start setting up on October 1st, and wouldn't look too closely at what was already there. They never did catch who did it. The van was stolen, found burned out 2 counties over a week later. Robert Henley's murder became one of those cases that goes cold after all the leads dry up. No enemies anyone knew about, no life insurance policies worth killing for, no affairs or gambling debts. Just a regular guy who sold insurance and coached Little League on weekends, whose body ended up as part of a Halloween display for 5 days before anyone realized. Frank took down all his decorations the day after the police finished processing his yard. Not just for that year, but permanently. I helped him haul boxes to the dump, watched him throw away thousands of dollars worth of props he'd collected over the years. He couldn't stand to look at any of it anymore, he said. Moved away 3 months later. Heard he went to Arizona where Halloween's not such a big deal. The new family that bought his house has no idea why nobody on our street really decorates for Halloween anymore. Why we all just leave our porch lights off and pretend we're not home when October 31st rolls around. Some things just kill the spirit of a holiday, you know. And every time I smell that particular sick, sweet smell, Whether it's roadkill or spoiled meat or whatever, I'm right back there, watching Frank realize that he'd been tending to a corpse for 5 days, adjusting its position, stepping around it with his morning coffee, proud of how realistic his display looked this year. Every house on Oakwood Drive had security cameras installed after the break-ins 2 summers ago, which is why what happened that night got captured from so many different angles. Living alone since my divorce, I'd gotten into a predictable rhythm. Warehouse job at the distribution center outside Madison, Wisconsin. Late shifts that ended at midnight. Same route home 5 nights a week. 32 isn't old, but it's old enough to appreciate a quiet routine, especially after the chaos of a messy split. That Halloween fell on a Tuesday in 2017, and the guys at work had decorated the loading dock with those cheap plastic skeletons that glow in the dark. We shared fun-size candy bars during our breaks, complained about the new scanning system that kept freezing up, and made the usual jokes about being stuck at work while kids were out collecting candy by the pillowcase full. Normal night, normal conversations, normal everything right up until I clocked out at 12:03 and headed to my car in the employee parking lot. Madison gets quiet after midnight, but that drive home felt like traveling through a ghost town. And I don't mean that in the Halloween decoration sense. The university district usually has at least a few drunk students wandering around, especially on Halloween, but the streets were completely empty. Not just empty, but wrong somehow. Like everyone had gotten some memo I'd missed about staying indoors. The 20-minute drive felt longer with no other cars on the road. Just me and my headlights cutting through patches of fog that had rolled in from the lakes. Every house I passed still had porch lights burning bright. Those universal Halloween signals that candy was available, except it was way too late for any kid to still be out. The McDonald's on Miller Road sat dark. The gas station that never closes had its pumps shut off. Even the police car that usually sits at the speed trap near the industrial park was nowhere to be seen. By the time I turned onto my street, my brain was trying to rationalize it all. Maybe there was some big event downtown I hadn't heard about. Maybe the weather forecast had warned about storms. Maybe I was just tired and overthinking everything. My driveway is one of those long gravel types that curves slightly, about 40 feet from the street to my garage, lined with these overgrown juniper bushes the previous owner planted in the 90s. As my headlights swept across the gravel, illuminating the path ahead, 2 figures came into view at the very end of my driveway, right where it meets the sidewalk. They were just standing there, perfectly still, facing my direction. Both wore those vintage clown masks, not the cheap plastic ones from party stores, but those old-school rubber ones with the wild orange hair, huge red noses, and painted smiles that stretched way too wide. One was notably taller, maybe 6'3", wearing what looked like a mechanic's coveralls splattered with dark stains. The shorter one, probably 5'8" or 5'9", had on a faded yellow raincoat despite the fact it hadn't rained in weeks. They weren't moving, weren't talking, just standing there like mannequins somebody had placed at the end of my driveway as the world's worst Halloween prank. My first thought was college kids being idiots, because Madison is full of them and Halloween brings out their worst judgment. I actually laughed a little, reaching for my phone to maybe snap a picture for my buddies at work. Check out these morons trying to scare me. But as I got closer, my headlights lit them up better, and that's when I noticed what the taller one was holding. Down by his side, gripped in his right hand like it weighed nothing, was a sledgehammer. Not a prop, not some foam Halloween decoration, but an actual sledgehammer with a worn wooden handle and a head that had seen some serious use. The shorter one's hands were empty, but stayed weirdly positioned at stomach level, fingers spread wide like they were pressing against invisible glass. Neither of them reacted to my car approaching, didn't shield their eyes from the headlights, didn't shift their weight or adjust their stance. They just kept staring through those mask eye holes, and even from inside my car, I could see their actual eyes behind the rubber, wide open, unblinking, focused directly on me. I stopped my car about 15 feet from them, engine running, doors locked without even thinking about it. The rational part of my brain kept insisting this was just an elaborate prank, but my gut was screaming something completely different. These weren't drunk college kids trying to get a reaction. There was something methodical about how they stood, something practiced and deliberate. I hit my high beams, flooding them with even more light. And still nothing. No flinch, no movement, just that horrible stillness. That's when I noticed other details that made my mouth go dry. The taller one's coveralls had fresh mud on the knees, like he'd been kneeling in dirt recently. The sledgehammer had something dark and wet on its head that definitely wasn't rust. The shorter one's raincoat had tears along the bottom, 3 parallel rips like something had clawed at it. My hand fumbled for my phone, nearly dropping it as I tried to dial 911 while keeping my eyes on them. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. A woman's voice, calm and professional, asking about my emergency. "There are 2 people in clown masks blocking my driveway," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "One of them has a sledgehammer. They're just standing there, not moving, and I'm trapped in my car." The dispatcher asked for my address, which I rattled off quickly, then asked if I was in immediate danger. Before I could answer, both clowns tilted their heads to the left at exactly the same moment, like synchronized swimmers performing some twisted routine. The movement was so sudden and coordinated that I actually jumped in my seat, my knee hitting the steering wheel. "They're moving," I said into the phone, hearing my voice crack this time. "Please send someone now." The dispatcher told me units were on the way, stay in the vehicle, keep the doors locked, and stay on the line. She asked me to describe what they were doing, but I could barely process it myself. The taller one had started tapping the sledgehammer against his palm, slow, rhythmic taps that I could actually hear through my closed windows. The shorter one began doing this weird swaying motion, shifting weight from foot to foot like a boxer warming up, those spread fingers finally curling into fists. Then they started walking toward my car. Not running, not rushing, just walking with these measured, deliberate steps that somehow felt more threatening than if they'd charged at me. The dispatcher kept asking what was happening, and I kept narrating like some twisted play-by-play announcer, but my voice was getting higher, tighter. "They're coming closer, maybe 10 feet away now. The tall one is raising the hammer." That's when I threw the car in reverse, tires spinning on the gravel, backing up fast toward the street. But here's the thing about my driveway. It curves, and backing up at night when you're panicking isn't exactly precision driving. I clipped one of those juniper bushes, felt the car lurch, overcorrected, and ended up with my back wheels in the grass of my front yard. The engine stalled. In that sudden silence, I could hear them crunching across the gravel, getting closer, and the dispatcher saying something about units being 3 minutes out. But 3 minutes felt like 3 hours when those masks were reflecting in my mirrors. I got the engine started again just as the sledgehammer came down on my hood. The sound was incredible. This metallic crash that made my ears ring left a dent the size of a dinner plate right in front of me. The shorter one pressed both palms flat against my driver's side window, and I could see every detail of those hands through the glass. Dirt under the fingernails, scratches across the knuckles, a gold wedding band on the left ring finger that somehow made everything worse because it made them human, real, not just Halloween decorations come to life. They started dragging their hands down the window, leaving these greasy smears, and that's when I heard it, laughing. Not maniacal movie villain laughing, but this low, satisfied chuckle coming from behind both masks. I gunned it backward again, heard them stumble away from the car, managed to get onto the street properly this time. The dispatcher was asking if I was okay, if I could drive to the police station, but I wasn't leaving my property to these psychos. I pulled across the street into Harold's driveway, the neighbor with all the decorations, and kept my headlights pointed at my house, engine running, ready to bolt if they came after me. From Harold's driveway, I watched them through my windshield, the dispatcher still on speakerphone asking for updates every few seconds. The 2 clowns stood in my yard for a moment, looking at each other like they were having some silent conversation. Then the shorter one walked over to my mailbox, this sturdy metal thing my ex-wife insisted we needed, and the taller one followed. Without any hesitation, the tall one swung that sledgehammer in a perfect arc and demolished the mailbox post in 2 hits. The whole thing toppled over into the street with this hollow clang that echoed through the neighborhood, but nobody came out to look. Not Harold, whose house I was parked in front of. Not the Andersons next door with their new baby who usually woke up at every little noise. Not even Doug from 2 houses over who worked security and always kept watch on the street. Every house stayed dark and quiet except for those porch lights, like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. The clowns started walking down the street, not hurrying, that same measured pace, and they stopped at the Andersons' driveway. What happened next still makes me sick to think about. The shorter one produced something from that yellow raincoat, a screwdriver maybe 8 inches long, and went straight for the Andersons' minivan tires. 4 quick, efficient punctures, 1 for each tire, the hissing sound carrying all the way to where I sat. The taller one took the sledgehammer to their garden gnomes, these silly things Jennifer Anderson had collected for years, pulverizing each one into ceramic dust with single swings. They moved to Doug's house next, and I watched the tall one cave in the windshield of his pickup truck, while the shorter one did something to his porch I couldn't quite see. The dispatcher kept saying units were almost there, 1 minute out, but these 2 were working their way down the street like they had all the time in the world. Every few houses they'd stop, look back at me still sitting in Harold's driveway with my lights on, and do that synchronized head tilt again. They wanted me to watch. This whole thing, whatever it was, they wanted me to see it all. The worst part was how quiet they were. No whooping or yelling or typical vandalism noise, just the sounds of destruction and those occasional low chuckles that drifted across the night air. Finally, I saw the blue and red lights coming down the street. 2 squad cars, no sirens, but lights flashing, moving fast. The clowns saw them too. They were standing in front of the Thompsons' house about 6 houses down from mine. And when those lights appeared, they just stopped. Didn't run, didn't panic, just stood there facing the approaching police cars. The cops pulled up, blocking them in, officers getting out with hands on their weapons, shouting commands I couldn't quite hear from where I sat. The 2 clowns raised their hands slowly, the tall one still holding that sledgehammer until an officer yelled at him to drop it. It fell to the pavement with a clang that seemed to break whatever spell had been hanging over the neighborhood. Suddenly, porch lights were flicking on. People were coming out of their houses in robes and pajamas, everyone talking at once. Harold came running out to his driveway where I was still parked, asking what the hell was going on, why I was there, what happened to my car. I couldn't even answer him properly, just pointed at the cops putting handcuffs on the 2 figures who were still wearing those horrible masks. The police took my statement that night, then again the next morning at the station. The 2 men in the clown masks were brothers from Beloit, about 40 minutes away, Tommy and Carl Bradshaw, ages 26 and 29. They'd driven up to Madison with a trunk full of tools and no explanation that made any sense. When the cops asked them why they did it, why they picked my street, why they stood at my driveway first, they wouldn't say a word. Just sat there in interrogation, no lawyers, no demands, completely silent. The detective told me they found my address written on a piece of paper in their car, along with 3 other addresses in different Wisconsin towns, but no connection between any of us. No mutual friends, no shared workplaces, nothing. They both pled guilty to vandalism, property destruction, and menacing. Got 18 months each, served 8. I never found out why they came to Oakwood Drive that night, why they waited at my driveway, why they wanted me specifically to watch what they did. The security footage from all those houses, including mine, showed them arriving at exactly 11:47, standing at the end of my driveway for 13 minutes before I got home, never moving, never checking phones, just waiting. Sometimes I still dream about those masks, those synchronized head tilts, that wedding ring catching the light. I moved out of that house 3 months later, got an apartment closer to work, one with a parking garage and a doorman. But every Halloween, When I see kids in clown costumes or those decorative masks in store windows, I remember that night and wonder if Tommy and Carl Bradshaw are out there somewhere, maybe wearing different masks this time, standing at the end of someone else's driveway. The last kid showed up at my door dressed as some character from a video game I didn't recognize, and I dumped the rest of my candy bars into his pillowcase just to be done with it. My feet were killing me from standing at the door for 3 hours straight, and the inflatable dinosaur costume I'd been wearing was making me sweat like crazy. After locking up and turning off the porch light, I collapsed on the couch and pulled out my phone to order food. The fridge had nothing but expired yogurt and beer, and Antonio's was the only pizza place still delivering this late on Halloween. Their app was acting weird, taking forever to load, but eventually my order went through. Large pepperoni, garlic knots, and a 2-liter of Coke. 45 minutes, the confirmation said. I peeled off that ridiculous dinosaur suit and grabbed a shower while I waited, figuring I had plenty of time. The doorbell rang right as I was pulling a shirt over my head, still damp from the shower. Through the peephole, I could make out a tall figure in a cracked skull mask holding what looked like a pizza bag. Nothing unusual for Halloween night. I'd seen 3 delivery drivers earlier wearing costumes while I was handing out candy. But when I opened the door, the guy just stood there, completely silent, his head cocked at this weird angle like he was examining me through those hollow eye sockets. The pizza bag in his hands was plain black. No logo or anything. Not the red insulated ones with Antonio's name that I'd seen dozens of times before. He was wearing a faded leather jacket over a black hoodie, and I noticed his jeans had dark stains on them, maybe grease or mud. After what felt like way too long, he finally spoke in this rough whisper that barely sounded human, saying $24.50 for the order. I handed him $30 and told him to keep the change, just wanting this interaction to end. But instead of leaving right away, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out this crumpled receipt, smoothing it against his thigh before handing it to me. His fingers were covered in these thick work gloves, the kind mechanics wear, with something dark caked under the fingernails. The receipt was just a plain white slip with my order typed out in basic computer font. No Antonio's header, no phone number, no address, nothing. When I looked up to ask about it, he was already walking away, but not toward any car I could see in my driveway. There was this beat-up gray sedan parked across the street that I'd never seen before. No delivery sign on top, no company stickers anywhere. He climbed in and just sat there for a minute with the engine off, and I could swear he was still watching my house through that cracked skull mask. The pizza tasted fine, maybe a little cold, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling while I ate. About 20 minutes later, I heard something outside. Not loud, just this subtle scraping sound like someone dragging something across concrete. My backyard motion light clicked on, flooding the patio with harsh white light. But from the kitchen window, I couldn't see anything out there. Then it clicked off after 30 seconds, the way it's supposed to, leaving everything dark again. I grabbed a flashlight from the junk drawer and went to check the back door, making sure it was locked. And that's when I noticed the doorknob was wet, like someone had just tried turning it with damp hands. The scraping sound came again, closer this time, from the side of the house where I keep the trash cans. My neighbor's dog started going absolutely crazy, barking and snarling in a way I'd never heard from that usually friendly golden retriever. I killed all the lights in my house and moved to the living room window, peeking through the blinds at the street. That gray sedan was gone, but I could see fresh tire marks in the wet leaves where it had been parked. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and I kept the flashlight gripped tight in my sweaty palm. Then I saw him, or at least I think it was him, standing at the far edge of my property line, just barely visible under the streetlight. Same height, same leather jacket, but the skull mask was gone, replaced by what looked like a plain black ski mask. He was holding something in his right hand, maybe a crowbar or a tire iron, just standing there perfectly still like he was waiting for something. I grabbed my phone to call 911. but my screen was frozen on the Antonio's app, showing my order as still pending, like I'd never received anything at all. The sound of breaking glass from my basement window sent me into full panic mode. I could hear footsteps down there, slow and deliberate, testing each stair to avoid the creaky spots like someone who'd been listening and learning. My phone finally unfroze, and I managed to dial 911, whispering frantically to the dispatcher while barricading myself in the upstairs bathroom. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs to the main floor, and I heard him trying the basement door that led to my kitchen. Thank God I'd installed that deadbolt last summer. The dispatcher kept telling me to stay calm, that units were on the way, but all I could focus on was the sound of metal scraping against metal as he worked on that lock. Then suddenly, complete silence. No footsteps, no scraping, nothing. Just me breathing hard in that tiny bathroom, sitting in the bathtub with a baseball bat I'd grabbed from my bedroom. The police siren started wailing in the distance, getting louder by the second, and I heard rapid footsteps running through my basement toward the broken window. By the time the cops got there, maybe 3 minutes later, he was long gone, leaving only muddy boot prints across my basement floor and scratches all over the deadbolt. The officers swept through my house with their guns drawn while I waited outside with a blanket around my shoulders, feeling like I was in some crime show. One of them, Officer Daniels, came out holding an evidence bag with that crumpled receipt I'd left on my kitchen counter. He asked me to confirm the name of the pizza place, and when I told him Antonio's, he got this concerned look on his face. Turns out, they'd called the restaurant. Antonio's had no record of my order, no driver working that night matching my description, and their last delivery had gone out at 9:15, over an hour before my pizza arrived. They found more evidence over the next hour that made everything worse. My security camera, which I'd honestly forgotten was even working, had captured the whole thing in grainy black and white footage. The guy had been circling my house for at least 30 minutes before ringing the doorbell, trying every window, checking every door, even lifting up my garage door a few inches to peer inside. At one point in the footage, he stood directly under the camera and looked up, that skull mask filling the entire frame, like he wanted me to know he knew it was there. The investigators found something else too, a receipt from a hardware store time-stamped from that afternoon, blown against my fence for items including work gloves, a crowbar, and zip ties. The cop showing me the footage pointed out something I hadn't noticed. In several frames, you could see another person sitting in that gray sedan. Just a shadow, really, but definitely someone else involved in whatever this was supposed to be. The detective assigned to my case, a woman named Rivera with tired eyes and coffee stains on her blazer, sat me down and explained what they thought had happened. These guys had been hitting houses all through October, using food delivery as a cover to scope out potential targets. They'd watch for people living alone, figure out their routines, then come back later for a home invasion. The Halloween angle was new though. With everyone wearing masks and costumes, nobody would think twice about a delivery driver in a skull mask. She showed me reports from 3 other neighborhoods where similar things had happened, though I was the only one where they'd actually tried to break in that same night. The pizza was real, she explained, probably from some cheap place across town, just to make the interaction seem legitimate enough that victims wouldn't immediately call the cops. What really got to me was when she mentioned they'd found similar boot prints at another house 2 streets over, where an elderly man had ordered Chinese food around 8 that same night. Officer Daniels came back with more questions and a laptop showing mugshots, asking if any of the faces looked familiar. But how could I tell when the guy never took off his mask? They had me walk through everything 3 more times, and each telling made me remember new details. The way he'd tilted his head when studying my house, how his breathing sounded labored through the mask, the chemical smell coming off his clothes like motor oil mixed with something else. Around 2 in the morning, after they'd photographed everything and taken the receipt as evidence, Rivera told me they'd be increasing patrols in the area, but suggested I might want to stay somewhere else for a few nights. My sister lived 40 minutes away in Terre Haute, and I called her from the police station parking lot. my voice shaking as I tried to explain why I needed to crash at her place without completely freaking her out about what had just happened. I stayed at my sister's place for a week, barely sleeping, jumping at every doorbell and delivery truck that passed by. When I finally went back home, I installed a new security system with cameras covering every angle, motion sensors that could detect a mouse, and one of those video doorbells that lets you see who's there from your phone. The police never caught those guys, at least not that they told me about, but the break-ins stopped after Halloween, just vanished like they'd never happened. Rivera called me 2 weeks later to say they'd found the gray sedan abandoned in a parking garage downtown, completely cleaned out except for a stack of fake receipts from various restaurants and a box of those cheap skull masks you can buy at any costume shop. The worst part was finding out from my neighbor months later that he'd seen someone in his backyard that same night, trying his shed door, but figured it was just drunk teenagers playing Halloween pranks and didn't call anyone about it. Even now, years later, I don't order delivery to my house anymore. I always pick it up myself or meet drivers at the gas station down the street where there are lights and cameras everywhere. Every Halloween when the doorbell rings, even when I can see it's clearly just kids in superhero costumes, my chest gets tight and I have to take a deep breath before opening the door. The detective was probably right about it being some organized crew that moved on to another city, but sometimes I wonder if that guy in the skull mask drives past my house occasionally, remembering the one that got away, maybe waiting for me to let my guard down and order another pizza on some random night. I keep that baseball bat next to my bed now, and I've gotten really good at recognizing the sound of every normal creak and settling noise my house makes, so I'll know immediately if something's actually wrong. The funny thing is, I found out later that Antonio's had actually closed at 9 that night due to their oven breaking down, which means whoever brought me that pizza had gone through the trouble of getting one from somewhere else, just to make their twisted plan work. It was one of those chilly late October evenings when the air smelled like wet leaves and pumpkin candles. My parents were both working the night shift that Halloween, so it was just me and my little brother Caleb. He was 8, dressed as a vampire with fake fangs that kept falling out, while I wore a cheap witch hat and an oversized sweater. Our neighborhood wasn't fancy, but people went all out with decorations, fake cobwebs in bushes, orange lights hanging from porches, and skeletons swaying from trees. It felt safe, familiar. I'd walked those streets my whole life, and I thought I knew everyone who lived there. We started around 6 when the sky was still a faded purple, and kids were running from door to door with plastic pumpkins. I remember how Caleb kept tugging on my sleeve, pointing at every house that had a fog machine or a motion-activated ghost. Everything felt normal, until I noticed the white van parked across from the Hendersons' house. No decorations, no logo, just plain white. The windows were tinted darker than usual, and I could barely make out if someone was inside. I told myself it was probably just a neighbor's friend, maybe someone visiting for the holiday. But about 20 minutes later, when we turned onto Willowbrook Lane, there it was again. Same white van, same spot near the corner. I laughed nervously and said something to Caleb about how funny it was that the same car kept following our route, but he didn't even look up. He was too busy counting his candy. I tried not to think about it, but my mind started piecing things together. The van hadn't passed us yet. Somehow it always ended up one street ahead. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe there were 2 vans that looked alike. By the time we reached the last few houses, most of the little kids had gone home, and the streets were quieter. Porch lights flickered on and off as people ran out of candy. That's when I saw the van again, parked halfway down Birchwood Court, its headlights off. It was angled slightly toward us, like it had stopped mid-turn. I held Caleb's hand tighter and said we were heading home. He groaned, saying he still wanted to hit just one more house, but I didn't answer. Something about that van, the stillness of it, the way it seemed to wait, made the back of my neck sting with cold air. When we reached our house, the porch light was still on, and I felt this wave of relief wash over me. Caleb ran ahead, already planning to dump his candy on the living room floor. I glanced back one last time before stepping inside, and the van rolled slowly past the corner, its headlights off again. It didn't stop, didn't speed up, just drifted by like it was scanning the neighborhood. I stood there until it disappeared behind the trees, pretending to check my phone so Caleb wouldn't see I was nervous. Dad came home not long after. He's the kind of person who keeps everything organized, from our bills to the neighborhood watch schedule. I told him about the van right away, expecting him to brush it off, but instead he frowned and went straight to his laptop. Our neighborhood has a shared camera system. Every few houses, someone has a motion-activated feed connected to a shared network. Dad started pulling up footage from earlier that evening, clicking through the timestamps as I stood beside him. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. We saw the van the first time, parked near the Hendersons. Then again on Willowbrook Lane, again on Birchwood Court. Each time it stopped for several minutes, lights off, before moving to the next street. Dad zoomed in on the license plate, but it was too blurry to read. He replayed one clip in slow motion, and we both saw a shadow inside the driver's seat. Someone tall, wearing what looked like a baseball cap. No movement, just sitting there waiting. Dad called the non-emergency police line, gave them the footage, and they said they'd send someone to check it out. While he was on the phone, I went to Caleb's room to tell him everything was fine, but when I looked out his window, I saw the van again, parked 3 houses down. This time, the headlights were on, faintly glowing against the pavement. The figure inside wasn't moving, but I could tell whoever it was facing our house. I shut the blinds without saying a word. The police arrived about half an hour later, 2 officers in uniform who walked the street with flashlights. By then, the van was gone. They took Dad's statement, copied the footage onto a USB drive, and told us they'd file a report. One of them said something about how Halloween nights always attract weird traffic, but I could tell from the look they exchanged that they took it seriously. They left their card and promised to follow up. That night, I barely slept. Every time a car passed, the sound of tires on wet asphalt made me sit up and check the window. The next morning, the neighborhood group chat was full of messages. 3 different parents had seen the same van. One said it had stopped outside their driveway while their kids were out front. Another claimed the driver rolled down the window and called something out before speeding off. People started sharing their own camera footage, and by noon, the van had been spotted across several streets. A few of the recordings even showed it stopping near kids walking alone. None of us could make out the driver's face. 2 days later, Dad got a call from a detective. They confirmed the van matched the description of one used in an attempted child abduction 2 towns away. Same make, same dented rear door, same partial license plate. They said the suspect hadn't been caught yet but was being tracked. When Dad told me, I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at Caleb's candy bucket still half full, realizing how close we might have been to something terrible. It's the kind of thing you never expect to touch your family until it does. Even now, years later, every Halloween feels different. I still walk Caleb, well, not so little anymore, around the block. But I catch myself scanning every car that passes. I know most people out there are harmless, just living their lives. But that night taught me something I can't unlearn. Sometimes the real monsters don't wear masks, and they're not inside haunted houses. They're parked quietly on the corner, waiting for you to stop paying attention. There are moments in life that carve themselves into your memory like scars, and that night became one of them for me. I had planned it for weeks, just a simple Halloween night with my son, Miles. He was 8, full of energy, and had been talking for days about dressing as a pirate. We lived in a quiet suburb where everyone knew each other, the kind of place where people waved from their driveways and kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. I remember tightening the strap of his plastic sword before we left, his small hands clutching the candy bucket shaped like a pumpkin. The air smelled like wet leaves and cheap fog machine smoke. Every porch flickered orange, and the whole neighborhood glowed with that soft excitement only Halloween brings. We walked house to house, laughing when Miles tripped over his costume or shouted "thank you" through his plastic mask. He was proud of how heavy his bucket had gotten. At some point, we joined a small group of families moving down the main street. Kids darting between lawns, parents chatting behind them. Everything felt safe, almost too perfect. It happened when we reached the corner house with the strobe lights and fake tombstones. I turned to greet one of the neighbors, a man I'd seen walking his dog a few times. And in that brief turn, Miles was gone. I called his name, expecting him to pop out from behind a bush or jump scare me like he loved to do. When he didn't answer, the laughter around me blurred into background noise. I checked the yard, then the sidewalk, then ran toward the end of the street. He was nowhere. His candy bucket lay tipped over near the curb, candy scattered across the wet grass. I started asking around, parents, kids, anyone. Most of them shook their heads, saying they hadn't noticed him wander off. But one woman mentioned seeing a firefighter leading a little boy toward a white SUV. She thought it was just a parent helping their kid get home early. I ran down the block, searching for the vehicle, but the street was crowded, headlights flashing everywhere. By the time the police arrived, the neighborhood had gone quiet, and the house where we'd stopped, the one with the fake tombstones, had its lights off. The officers asked me to describe exactly what I saw, and I kept repeating the same useless details: the flashing strobe lights, the fake fog, the sound of kids laughing. I pointed to the house, insisting that was where we had been standing. But when they checked, the place looked completely different. The decorations were gone, the porch was dark, and the windows were covered with wooden boards that looked like they had been there for years. I remember standing there completely confused, as if the whole setup had been erased in minutes. The officer shone his flashlight on the ground where Miles's candy had spilled, and the reflection of the wrappers looked almost metallic under the beam. They questioned every neighbor on that street, but nobody could say who lived in that house. One man swore it had been vacant since he moved there, and another said it used to belong to an elderly couple who'd passed away years ago. No one had seen anyone move in or out recently. When they pulled up property records, there wasn't even a registered address matching that spot anymore. It was just listed as a lot, with no dwelling number. The more the police checked, the more everything stopped making sense. I stayed out until dawn, calling his name until my voice cracked. Every shadow looked like him for a second. Every distant laugh made my heart leap. The officers promised to keep searching, but as the days passed, their updates became shorter, less hopeful. They found no tire marks matching an SUV, no security footage that captured a firefighter costume, and no candy wrappers from the brand Miles loved near the area where I found his bucket. It was as if the night had swallowed him whole. Weeks later, I started walking that same route every evening after work. The house was still there, or what looked like a version of it. The boards, the empty porch, the uneven lawn. But every now and then I'd see something out of place, a faint orange glow behind one of the boarded windows, or the flicker of a strobe light for half a second before it vanished. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined that house. One night near the end of that month, I parked across from the empty lot and just sat there with the engine off. The street was silent except for the hum of distant traffic. Then, right around the same hour when Miles disappeared, the porch light came on. It was faint, like a bulb struggling to stay alive, but it was there. The fog drifted across the yard exactly the way it had that night. I got out of the car and walked closer, trying to convince myself it was a coincidence. From the sidewalk, I could hear faint laughter inside the house. Kids' voices, giggling, echoing through the boards. When I called out, everything stopped. No sound, no light, just the cold air moving through the trees. I stood there for what felt like forever before forcing myself to leave. The next morning I returned with an officer, but the house was gone again. Just grass and dirt where it had stood hours earlier. He told me to take a break from the area, said grief can twist perception, but I wasn't confused. I knew where I had been. I knew what I saw. Months later, a neighbor I barely knew slipped a small object into my mailbox. A plastic pirate sword, broken near the handle. The same cheap kind I had tightened for miles that night. No note, no explanation. I called the police, but they couldn't trace who left it. They said maybe it was someone's idea of a cruel prank. I stopped pushing after that. I stopped talking about it altogether. It has been years now, and Halloween still makes me uneasy. Every October, I think about that flickering porch light and the laughter behind those boarded windows. Sometimes I drive through the old neighborhood, half hoping to see that house again, half dreading it. No one ever found Miles, and no one ever found that white SUV. But some nights I swear I can still hear his voice, faint and distant, calling from somewhere down that same street, asking if we can visit just one more house. The night air carried that mix of cold and leftover smoke from bonfires people light around Halloween. I had spent the evening at a small get-together hosted by an old college friend, someone who still thought themed costumes were mandatory no matter how old we got. By the time I left, it was past midnight, and the roads were almost empty. The party had been out in a rural area where the highway cuts through long stretches of pine and farmland, the kind of place where your headlights feel like the only thing keeping the darkness from swallowing the world. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No cars, no music, just the hum of my tires against the pavement. A few miles down, I saw red and blue flashes reflecting off the trees ahead. My first thought was that there'd been an accident or maybe a drunk driving checkpoint since it was Halloween night. As I slowed, I could make out two figures in reflective jackets standing near orange cones. A patrol car parked slightly crooked on the shoulder with its lights spinning. One of the men motioned for me to pull over. His hand movements were quick, almost impatient, and I remember how oddly close the other figure stood to him, not really doing anything, just watching. I rolled down my window halfway and greeted the one who approached. He leaned down and asked for my license in a tone that was polite, but clipped, like someone repeating a rehearsed line. Something about his voice didn't match the badge glinting under the lights. It sounded too young. When I handed over my license, his flashlight swept through the car interior longer than necessary, pausing on the passenger seat. Behind him, the second man was pacing, not really paying attention to the supposed checkpoint duties, just circling slowly, boots crunching gravel. Except they weren't boots. When he stepped closer, the reflective light caught white sneakers. That small detail sank in slower than it should have. I glanced at the patrol car again, noticing how its paint looked duller, like an old vehicle that had been resprayed. The markings seemed slightly off, too close together. My nerves prickled and I started to ask which department they were from, but before I could finish, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. Bright, steady, moving fast. A second later, the sound of a real siren cut through the night. The man holding my license froze for a second, then suddenly turned and shouted something I couldn't make out. Both of them bolted toward the tree line, disappearing into the woods, as the new cruiser rolled up behind me. The real officer who stepped out of the cruiser was older, with a calm expression that didn't match the chaos I'd just witnessed. He asked me to keep my hands visible, and then approached cautiously, flashlight steady. I told him what had happened, how two men had stopped me and taken my license before running off. He immediately called something into his radio and told me to stay in the car. More patrol cars started arriving within minutes, their lights bouncing off the trees like some kind of eerie warning. One of the officers shined a light into the woods, revealing a narrow trail of footprints heading downhill toward a creek. When they found my license, it was lying near the cones, half buried in the gravel, along with a few others. There were at least 5 IDs scattered around, a pair of zip ties, and what looked like an imitation badge. The fake patrol car turned out to be an old sedan painted over with magnetic decals that peeled when the officers touched them. It made my skin crawl to think how easily they could have fooled someone else. If the real cruiser had not shown up, I had no idea what those men were planning to do. The thought kept looping in my head while I waited inside my car, engine still running, heat blowing through the vents. They asked if I could describe the men, but all I could really say was that one was tall with a shaved head, and the other had a heavy build, wearing that ridiculous pair of sneakers. Both wore jackets with reflective strips, but they didn't match. One had a tear near the shoulder, the other looked new. The officers exchanged glances when I said that. One of them mentioned quietly that there had been similar fake checkpoints reported earlier that night on other roads nearby. That hit me harder than anything. It meant these guys weren't improvising. They had planned this, maybe even rehearsed it. When I finally got home, I parked in my driveway and sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. The adrenaline had drained out, leaving behind this dull, heavy feeling that sat in my chest. My phone kept lighting up with missed calls and messages from friends asking if I'd gotten home safely. I couldn't bring myself to answer any of them yet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that crooked badge glinting under the patrol lights and those sneakers moving toward the shadows. Even weeks later, when I drove past that stretch of highway, I caught myself slowing down, half expecting to see those fake officers again. A few days later, a detective from the county sheriff's office called to follow up. He said the men who fled my stop were still being identified but had likely been involved in similar setups on other rural roads that same night. Apparently, they targeted people driving alone, mostly women heading home late. The detail made my stomach twist. He thanked me for staying calm and reporting everything clearly. I did not feel calm. Every part of that night still replayed in fragments. The fake car, the crooked badge, the way one of them kept circling like he was waiting for the right moment. For weeks after that, I avoided driving alone at night. If I had to, I kept my phone on speaker with someone from my family while I drove, headlights locked on the road ahead. Friends would tease me about being paranoid, but then the news broke about another checkpoint, this time 2 counties over. Same fake patrol lights, same reflective jackets. The victims in that case had driven straight through without stopping, and that probably saved them. I remember thinking how close I had come to not being one of the lucky ones. The sheriff's office later confirmed the fake patrol car had been reported stolen from a small auction lot. The IDs they found by the cones belonged to people who had been robbed weeks before in nearby towns. It was like these men collected trophies, pieces of other people's lives to make their act seem more believable. I never found out if they were caught. The calls stopped coming, and eventually the story faded from the local news. But I never drove that stretch of highway again. Even now, years later, every time I see flashing lights on a dark road, my heart races before logic catches up. I pull over only in well-lit places, and I double-check every badge and uniform I see. I know those men are probably long gone, maybe even caught, but the fear they left behind still rides with me. Sometimes when the wind rustles through the trees at night and I catch a glimpse of red and blue through the branches, I have to remind myself it is only passing traffic, and not the echo of that Halloween when monsters dressed as cops tried to make me disappear.